So this is our third panel of the Technology and Society Conference, sponsored by CUNY and UC Berkeley. And I'm pleased to welcome you to this panel, which will feature talks by social scientists, as well as commentary from a philosopher and a corporate leader on themes such as the transformations of work and leisure. We will also be exploring themes about social inequality, hierarchy, and social mobility. And so we'll have 3 presentations and 2 commentator talks as well. And of course, this will be broadcast via Zoom for those who couldn't make it here today. So we will start off with Professor Michael Hout. And Michael Hout is Professor of Sociology at NYU and Director of the Center for Advanced Social Science Research there, where he studies social and economic inequalities. So I will give the floor over to Professor Hout.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And I'll take this off for the talk part. I've got a good old-fashioned cold, and it's caused me to miss all the other sessions. I feel bad about it, but and I've got some handy wipes here, so you guys will be safe. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk today about a set of ideas around the specific returns of education within specific occupations, and in a lot of detail. I want to acknowledge our funders, NSF and Russell Sage, and I workshopped this at Cornell a couple of weeks ago, and thanks to those folks for making it better. We're used to looking at charts like this, and I bring this up because I could have had, if the Bureau of Labor Statistics would have cooperated, a much longer chart that ran this thing all the way back to 1970. These lines, they're impressive. The top line is the pay, the weekly earnings of people who have a college degree. The next line are people who have some college, and that sky blue line is the weekly pay of people with a high school education. And we see a bit of growth in that gap in the 21st century, but it was already there in the 1970s. It was 80% as big as it was in 2020 back then. And our main understanding from the 90s is that we got here by skill-biased technological change, but it made my co-author and me, I forgot to acknowledge her, I'm sorry. Her name is Ananda Martin-Koya, and she's presenting in a half hour this very paper at the Population Association of America. So how do you get to be in 2 places at once? Be 2 people. So we're both speaking this morning on this. Okay, so if they're already there in the 70s before the technological change, where did they come from? Well, sociologists and economists have been debating for years where did they come from, but fundamentally where they come from are the institutions that link the job market to the educational system to the job market, and they come from the institutions that people encounter when they arrive at their point of employment. That could be a labor union, that could be a pay scale, that could be a University of California / CUNY style prescribed salary level, or it could be, one of the big shocks I got when I moved to NYU, I had to sign a thing saying I would never tell anybody what I make except the IRS. Yeah, non-disclosure, that's a different kind of institutional arrangement than public universities that were my previous experience are. So these are the kinds of labor market institutions that we think are behind differences of this sort. And in particular, we cite a lot of of real classics in the from the 60s and 70s, but there are two things that I want to really bring your or three papers that I want to bring your particular attention to, because you may not have encountered them. They're from the last couple of years. First is Siwei Cheng et al.'s paper in Sociological Science in 2019, where they look at programming, the use of computer programming on the job, and how much that puts a lever between somebody's pay. What is the return to being a programmer versus not within a given occupation other than the occupation of programmer? And they estimate it to be about 0.3%. It ended up in Sociological Science instead of the ASR because it was 0.3% instead of 3%. The publication bias dumped it down, and you might have missed it. But it's a really important null finding. Programmers don't make a whole lot more than non-programmers within the same occupation, other obviously than the occupation of programmer. The second paper is Ananda's paper in ASR in December 2021, where she goes through the verbatim text. The Census Bureau, when they do the current population survey, and that's going to be our data source, or the General Social Survey, when they code occupations, they don't say, what's your occupation, and people give a one-word answer. People are asked, what's your job title? What are your principal tasks and responsibility at work? And they dump a whole text on you. They speak out. These surveys are done, at least in the first wave, face-to-face. The CPS allows people to fill it out online after the first wave. GSS until 2021 was face-to-face. And so people aren't typing it in themselves. They're speaking it out. They're describing their job to an interviewer. Ananda got those verbatim texts that had been sent then to professional occupational coders to get resolved into a 4-digit number that is the occupation that is on the data set. But all that text is really rich, and she analyzes the text in a paper and finds a number of really important gendered patterns within those. So I highly recommend it. That's not our topic today, but go read that paper for that. But specifically for us, she finds a lot of complexity. Some occupations actually, like our own, people do tend to give a very short answer. What's your occupation? I'm a professor of sociology. What do you do? I research and teach sociology. Most sociologists will say some version of that, and so they get a very high similarity score on that. Similarly, high school teachers. I teach, their differences are in what they teach. I teach English, I teach physics, whatever. That last word is different, but those first two words are the same, and so they get a middle range similarity score. And then there are people who have a really hard time explaining their job. My son's first job out of college was, he used to describe it as he was a personal digital assistant. This was before we had smartphones. Back then we had these, kludgy devices that were about the size of a cell phone that had a calendar and a couple of other things in it. You could put a memo in there and stuff. It was pretty dumb, but it was the size of a smartphone. He worked for a guy as a personal assistant, and his job was to go through this guy's email and tell him, read these 5. He kept his calendar. He says, I'll call him Steve. Steve, you've got to be there in a half an hour. You better leave. All the functions we expect from our phones. And so he described his job as personal digital assistant. Well, telling the GSS or the CPS about this would take him quite a long time. Those are the occupations that score high on, they score low on similarity. There were a bunch of people doing similar kinds of work early in the 20th century. They all get very low similarity scores because they all tell a different story about that, and then the Census Bureau coders put them all give them all a 4-digit code. And then Tom DePreet and an international team in AJS in 2017 had a paper on linkage where they look at the institutions and licensing that link occupations to particular degrees, certificates, or college majors. And they find much more linkage in Germany than they find in the United States. And because of the way in which the educational system is articulated with the workforce in Germany compared to the United States. Interestingly, though, it doesn't explain the difference between Germany and the United States in the degree of pay inequality. But it's there anyway. They've uncovered this important international difference. And so these things all sort of mush together, and they get Ananda and me to think about differences across the occupational system in the rate of return to education. Oh yeah, and then there's the whole thing on skill bias, technological change. Ruth's going to have more to say about that in the interest of time, so I can show you my results. I'm just going to say skill bias, technological change is fundamentally an equation that has just two parts to it. A substantive part and then a residual, which is technology. And so relatively early on in all that, others had critiques of what was going on. I bring up Eric Wright's organizational assets because it's going to turn out to be important at the end, so I flag that. But Roberto Fernandez, Neil Fligstein, Dave Card, John DiNardo, Tali Cristal, and Yinan Cohen all had papers critiquing and criticizing skill bias, technological change. Those are familiar papers. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on them, but the point is there was skepticism out of the gate about skill bias, technological change. There's this important recent paper by David Otter and Golden and Katz that notes how skill bias, technological change using the standard decomposition waned after 2000, explaining only 38% of inequality growth in the 21st century compared to 3/4 of the growth from 1980 to 2020, when everything in the model is called technology. So here we're going to go through 451 detailed occupations. There are 452 in the current population survey, but one of them is the military, which is a very diverse. All the military people are on one line, so we drop them because we know it's either the most complex occupation in the world, or it's really a bunch of different occupations. Either way, we decided to drop it. And then we're going to identify some occupational characteristics that predict the rate of return for each occupation. And what we find, I'm going to hit the, we got to penalize everybody who walks in a little late here. I'm going to give the conclusion now and then elaborate it later, and they're going to be baffled. Returns to education are consistently positive for almost all occupations, and we think the ones that show up negative, they're tiny. They're less than 1% of the workforce. We think it's sampling fluctuation and/or measurement error. The average return is 9%. Now, you're used to seeing 20 and 25% return for a college degree based on analyses of the sort that I led with. This is a much smaller number because this is within the occupation. Much of the action of education gets you the job. And this is what the education gets you within your particular occupation. So comparing people with some college and a college degree within the occupation of retail store manager, for example. The college graduates make more. Within the occupation of police and detectives, the college graduate cops make more. They're also more likely to pick up DNA evidence and other stuff, and that might be why they're paid. I don't know. CSI replaces whatever. But there's a lot of heterogeneity there. There are some occupations that are near zero and some that are in the ballpark of the 25% rate of return that we're used to looking at in ones that don't control for occupation. Returns rise as socioeconomic status rise, that is, people in high status occupations get a bigger boost from their education than people in low, so that mythical, we don't find any in the CPS, by the way, that mythical history PhD driving Uber doesn't get the same boost as that history PhD teaching history. Institutional factors, not technological factors, are the key. The educational system, and I'll have more to say about this in about a minute and a half, has the highest returns. Who values education more than teachers? And it turns out that if you then go, and you're required to be recertified every 5 years in most states, and the best way to get recertified is go to a local university and take a course at the ed school, and you take enough of those, you get an MA and a pay boost, guaranteed. You know that's coming. And turns out that institution, that built-in return, it shows up in the data. It matters. It's much bigger than the rate of return in most occupations. Complex occupations, that professional digital assistant kind of occupation, all else being equal, socioeconomic status and portion who have college degrees and all that, also have higher returns. We included technological skills and newness. We just thought, okay, well, the new techie occupation. Actually, most of the new occupations are in the hospitality industry, it turns out. But so newness gets zilch. But technological levels from ONET, we got the technological skills required for an occupation from the what used to be the Dictionary of Occupational Titles is now ONET, and we got a near zero coefficient there. Not statistically significant. Point estimate, 0.003. Maybe even minus 0.003. So I'm not going to bother with that. We controlled for all the usual suspects. We've got a complicated, I'll say this much. We've got a complicated individual level model that includes all the demography and geography and so on that is in the current population survey to control individual differences as much as we can. And then it's a hierarchical linear model, so then occupation sits at a higher level. People are nested within occupations. And we allow the return to education, the gender pay gap, and the racial pay gap to differ across occupations. And there are 2 more papers on the gender and racial pay gaps to come. But that's sort of what we're up to here. So here's the haystack of differences. It clusters around 0.09, which is the midpoint. Some of this shape is a function of the estimation technique, but the key thing I wanted to point out and had mentioned at the outset is this is less than 1% of people. It's more than 1% of occupations, but it's less than 1% of people are out here below zero. The mass of the distribution is right in the neighborhood of the average of 0.09. And then there are some occupations that have these 20 and 25% payoffs to education. And I'm going to talk about both ends of the distribution. Here's the top 20. I'm showing in orange. It's sort of brown on this screen. It's vermilion on my palette. The jobs that are in the educational sector. Post-secondary teachers, secondary teachers, educational administrators, pre-K and kindergarten teachers, special ed teachers, and elementary teachers. 6 of the top 20 occupations are in the educational sector. And the only teaching occupation not in the top 20 is teachers not elsewhere classified. These are music teachers at the piano store and so on like that. Art teachers at the arts and crafts store. So all of the educational occupations in the educational sector are in the top 20 of returns. A few other interesting ones, personal financial advisors, CEOs. This is the organizational assets aspect of it in the right class scheme. Librarians are kind of teacher adjacent, and more than half of them work in schools, and they kind of benefit from that, but they're not teaching. This one's interesting. The economists and market researchers who are not post-secondary teachers. So these are economists at a bank, economists at a company, and also market researchers. These are complex occupations, but they're also high status and high return occupations. Physician assistants and optometrists are also up there. What's that? Well, I can't explain every single one of them. There's one other organizational assets one, these stock sales agents. Dietitians and nutritionists, physician assistants. These folks don't make much money, but if they have a degree from a community college, so it's mostly a contrast between high school and some college, and that's where we're seeing that return. This is when junior college pays off. When you're in an occupation of this sort and your competition only has a high school degree. Caveat to Richard Aram's master's paper in Sociology in whatever that was, 1992 or whenever, about if you got a really high quality vocational ed program at a high school, you save people 2 years. They don't have to go to the community college to get it. But for the most part, that's what it's about, is some college versus high school. Who's in the bottom 20? Well, there are a lot of highly regulated federal government sort of jobs, especially the postal service clerks and the mail carriers. Where did they go? I lost my mail carrier. There they are. There are also a number of jobs that have licensing but not tied to a credential, like barbers, drafters, and I guess that's it. And then there are a number of just sort of a mixed bag here. We're still trying to understand why the dental assistants and dental hygienists are at the low end while we had the physical therapists and whatever else the other one was up here at the high end. We're working on that. We don't fully understand that one. But here's one that bears attention. Physicians and surgeons. How did they end up at the bottom? Don't you have to have an MD to be a physician and a surgeon? Yes, there's no variance. But in the data, there is a little bit. So there are some people who aren't really physicians and surgeons who are in that occupation by the coder just misread it or whatever. More likely, they just put down their college. They did not put down that they also had an MD. It goes without saying. I'm a physician, or whatever. I don't know what's going on, but it's measurement error. And as stats theory predicts, that biases the coefficient towards zero, and we hit darn near absolute zero on that one. Lawyers and judges are just beyond. They're number 27. Same story. They're architects, very low return, although there are some BA to MA differences among architects, and they're in like 70s or 80s. So in the full model, we have a correction for this tendency. Basically, it functions the same as having a dummy variable for having 90% plus having an advanced degree. Educational maxing erases the returns to education. So here is our model we're using to predict this variation. At baseline, we just put in socioeconomic status, and that was almost a third of the variation. And I'll show you an array of that in a second, because it's worth looking at in its own right. But then we add the structural variables, which the structural variables, I had a table and I've deleted that to save you mental space. The complexity of the occupations, the union representation of the occupations, whether it's in the educational sector or somewhere else in the economy, and whether it's in transport or somewhere else in the economy. Because, I forgot to point out back there, there's truck drivers, taxi drivers, and the people who repair those vehicles. are all in the bottom 20. So we put that in as a structural factor. And that accounts for another 20% of the variation. Almost all the lifting is being done by complexity. Then we add technological skills and we get 0.01 bump in R square, and that coefficient is virtually 0. And similarly, when we add newness, we get a darn near 0. So this is pretty strong evidence that what's going on is some mix of socioeconomic standing and complexity of the occupations, the high status jobs. And so here I'm showing, now that's a little paler than I hope. Can we zap the lights that are on the screen only? Maybe not. Okay. So what we see here is the regression, the baseline model result. We've got socioeconomic status along the x-axis, return to education on the y-axis. So these are the high return occupations. These are the low return occupations. And this is that regression slope. And it's by social science standards, it's a pretty good fit. Correlation of 0.5 something and an R square of 0.3. Here are the pre-K and kindergarten teachers. They're actually quite low in occupational status because most pre-K and kindergarten teachers actually make less than median earnings. Time? Okay. All right. Key things that we might have missed so far. Those are their mail carriers and physical. I guess I actually ended up covering most of this. These are some middle, these are people who assist the top of their profession. So the engineering technologists are assisting the engineers. The diagnostic technologists are assisting the physicians and surgeons. And they don't get much of a return to their education. We're trying to understand that a little bit. And this one blew us away. Network and IT administrators actually don't get much of a return on credentials either. And so what are we going to make of this? Well, part of this is just repeating the conclusions that I led with. But I do want to get down here. I did remember to say this, that all of this is within occupations. Ignoring occupation, the total marginal effect of education is about 18%. And do I have one more slide? Oh, that's the table that I decided not to bother you with. Okay, so with that, I'll wrap up and we can take. Are we going to do questions or are we going to do all of us? Okay. All right. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll turn it over to whoever's next.
Professor Hout, for that very stimulating talk. So next up is Professor Ruth Milkman, right? I'm sorry, Alexandrea Ravenelle. Okay. So Alexandrea Ravenelle is assistant professor in sociology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and is currently a faculty fellow with the Center for Urban and Regional Studies. And she has written extensively about the gig economy.
Cool. Thank you. Good. Perfect. Can you give me notes view on my side? Oh, okay. Surprise! All right. Well, what I will be talking about today is the siren song of gig work, short-term solution, long-term problem. And I was reliant on notes, so let's see how this goes. There we go. When it comes to the tension between progress and risk, there may be few technologies that illustrate this tension more than the rise of the gig economy. In the last few years, I've had the opportunity to engage in 3 research projects on gig workers. First, my dissertation, which became Hustle and Gig, which involves interviews with 78 gig workers for 4 services: Airbnb, Uber, TaskRabbit, and the now defunct former Rent-A-Chef service, Kitchen Surfing. A second project looking at elite gig workers who make a minimum wage of $100 an hour or $1,000 a day. And then a third project looking at interviews with 199 gig and precarious workers in New York. This is a panel study that is now in its third panel in the last 2 years. So we are looking at the impact of the pandemic. So it's a lot of interviews. And today I'm going to be drawing on those 3 different studies to talk about some larger trends in gig work and the implications for worker careers. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the funders that have made this work possible, National Science Foundation, the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, and a Labor Research Action Network grant. A number of grad students and undergrads have also worked on this project, Savannah Newton and Don Colton, and Ken Kai Kowalski and Erica Janko. To start off, I'd like to introduce you to 2 gig workers I've had the opportunity to meet over the last few years. This is a stock photo to represent race, sex, and rough age. My IRB would kill me if it was actually his photo. This is Marcus. I met Marcus for the first time in 2015. He was working for TaskRabbit. He had previously been working as a temp for FedEx scanning packages. He'd also had an unpaid internship for a web startup, and he'd had a long stretch of unemployment due to the Great Recession. When he was doing his task work in 2015, he was doing walking deliveries for an early version of Uber Eats, and he was doing TaskRabbit. And in many ways, gig work seemed like a really big improvement over his previous work. He could listen to music, he controlled the pace, he didn't have a boss standing over him. Everything seemed great. He also kind of enjoyed the work, especially later on when he ended up moving to the Midwest and upgrading from being a walking delivery person to a scooter and then eventually to a bicycle. He enjoyed the rush of going through the city, of passing all the cars that were stuck in traffic. As he described it, it's addictive. It's a rush. There's nothing as exhilarating as being on a bike in those moments. But Marcus had a college degree. And in 2015, when I met him for the first time, he was talking about gig work as a temporary solution. He was still looking for another job. And in 2019, he was still looking for another job. And he discovered it was very difficult to explain to a recruiter what he had been doing for the last few years. He actually ended up employing a career counselor to help him with this project. Flash forward to 2022, and Marcus is still doing gig work. He has given up the dream of becoming a copywriter and using his college degree, and his short-term solution has now become a 9-year career. Now, it's difficult to transition out of being a courier back into office work. We don't typically expect somebody who's working in a restaurant to suddenly end up in corporate America. So maybe it's naive to think that being his own boss would give him a chance to move forward in life. So then I give you Benjamin. Benjamin was a C-suite executive for a bank in Central America when his marriage crumbled. He needed to move back to New York and control his own schedule for when he had access to his children. So he ended up turning to elite gig platforms. And several years into his career on these gig platforms, he thinks of himself as like a hotel room or an airline. What he is selling is his time. And so he has to pick up high-paying clients when he can and shelf the low-paying ones and go from there. Did that move? That did not move. There we go. In many ways, gig work has been wonderful for him. It gives him a chance to spend time with his children, it gives him some scheduling flexibility, but in the very next breath, he notes that when he doesn't have work, there's a moment of anxiety. That when he doesn't have the kids, he's searching for work. He's fetching, he's hustling, sending emails, reaching out, looking for opportunities. Even though these platforms promise work and the opportunity to control your own schedule in life, there's not a huge valve of opportunities. Now, even though he has a minimum wage of $1,000 a day, those gigs tend to be short. They're not long lasting. They don't fill up the entire year. And so Benjamin has been looking for a job for the last few years. He believes he has a great resume. He was a C-suite executive previously, but in the last 4 years, he has only gotten one interview. He barely gets past from the resume stage into the interview stage, something that he describes as embarrassing. Now, both of these men turned to gig work in a time of need. But after several years of hustling, they're eager to leave gig work behind. Yet, what they thought was a temporary solution has ended up becoming a much longer-term career and may have implications for their careers and life chances going forward. As a result, this short-term, benefit-less work ends up being at odds with the promise of endless flexibility, entrepreneurial opportunity, and limitless income marketed by the gig platforms. We have a lot of conversations in the media about what gig work is, so I like to start us out with just making sure we're all on the same page. So in many ways, gig work or short-term, infrequent, informal, and sometimes paid by the piece work has always been around. Before the rise of the standard employment relationship after World War II, many workers with employers participated in inside contracting system where management provided equipment, or the putting out or giving out system where they were given raw materials and having to assemble things on their own time. Now, modern day gig work is often traced back to the sharing economy. The sharing economy was one of the first efforts to utilize app-based technologies that focus on the lending or renting of assets or services, either for profit or for higher good. 3 technological advancements: smartphones, secure cashless payment systems, and customer review sites helped to make the sharing economy and eventually the gig economy possible. And then, of course, the Great Recession, with its underemployment of college graduates and the need to monetize and make do with less, further pushes forward this need to make money on apps. Yeah, we're in the right spot. All right. Now, gig works often market this work as offering entrepreneurship to the masses. Platforms such as Uber, Lyft, and Handy advertise themselves as offering a flexible schedule, earnings that are only limited by personal hustle and drive, and the opportunity to be free of workplace politics and meddling bosses. Altogether, it sounds great. And unsurprisingly, many workers are finding that to be a very appealing marketing message. According to a Pew Research Center study done in August of 2021, released in 2021, 16% of Americans had ever earned money via an online gig platform. And those numbers are even higher for younger individuals. 18 to 29-year-olds, about 30% have ever earned money on a gig platform. We see similar numbers with the Shed study. Now, gig work can also offer an opportunity for networking. For individuals who are driving for Uber or Lyft, they often can speak to their passenger who is stuck in the back seat of the car and talk to them about their marketing opportunities, try to sell their t-shirts, their denim design programs. Many of you have probably had that experience of talking to an Uber driver and they're like, here's my business card, let's talk about something else. The kitchen surfing platform, which was a rent-a-chef platform, was often used by chefs in order to market their side hustles. So a woman who was a cheesemonger would use the opportunity to literally get her foot inside the door of people's homes and then start talking about her cheese business and the cheese parties she could host for them. For elite gig workers, these platforms also offer the opportunity for networking, putting them in touch remotely with hiring managers, with senior personnel who might be hiring them and who might have openings later on. For elite gig workers especially, there can also be the opportunity to gain skills. For individuals who are well established in their career, it can be difficult to pivot to another industry, but elite gig work platforms can offer that opportunity to move from oil and gas into healthcare without having to return to business school. And then recently, we've seen 2 other reasons why workers have turned to gig work. During the pandemic, gig work often functioned as a side hustle safety net for workers. Although many platforms like Uber and Lyft driving actually saw a decrease in demand, other platforms for grocery shopping, for food delivery actually saw an increase. And workers who were struggling to get unemployment, or who did not want to get unemployment due to ideological reasons, or who felt that it wasn't for them, it, quote, wasn't for people who work, which is astute in many ways, but also not, in some cases ended up turning to gig work, turning to the side hustle safety net. As a result, we see that some workers end up turning to this gig work to make ends meet, or when they're experiencing massive delays in receiving their unemployment assistance. And then for some workers who were bored or trapped at home during the lockdowns, the essential nature of food delivery and of grocery shopping actually served as a, quote, get out of jail free card for them. They were able to maneuver around the city freely. They could say that they were an essential worker. In some cases, they also qualified to get their vaccines early. So some people signed up to do food delivery for a couple of deliveries so that they could get to the start of the queue. During the George Floyd protests, and the unprecedented week-long curfew that was implemented in New York, some workers found that being a food delivery worker meant that they were outside the restrictions of the curfew. And they could actually say, when stopped by the police, I'm doing a food delivery, I'm allowed to be out and about. One worker actually told me that they had the food delivery workers serve as couriers to help move people after the curfew hour. And they would simply say, oh, I'm doing a food delivery, and these are the people helping me do the food delivery. Now, increasingly, some of the growth that we have started to see in gig work isn't just about individuals choosing this sort of entrepreneurship for all marketing, but about an increasing gigification of jobs. Companies are utilizing gig workers to fill jobs that might have previously been staffed by W-2 employees. Now, in many ways, TaskRabbit really started this charge. One of their early iterations was a TaskRabbit for Business that allowed businesses to hire temp workers as 1099 workers. And TaskRabbit would handle all of the paperwork and make sure everything was fine. But that effort ended after just a few years. And in the meantime, we've seen other efforts start. Paired, which was founded in 2015 by a technology veteran and a former per se chef, has helped to bring the gig economy to restaurant work. Marketed as an on-demand matching tool for restaurant workers and restaurants, the platform brings 1099 work or independent contractor work directly into kitchens, so that work that is already difficult and unstable becomes ever more precarious with the addition of the 1099 classification. Now these workers have no guarantee of work from one day to another, and there are no benefits or workplace protections for them. Likewise, although delivering store products previously might have been done by a store employee or by an outside contracting service, recently we've seen the rise of Roadie, a crowdsourced delivery platform of 200,000 gig workers that works with stores such as Home Depot to deliver products to customers. Last year, Roadie was purchased by UPS, which is one of the Teamsters' largest contracts and probably does not bode well for organized labor, recent Amazon unionization aside. Now, just like informal work has always been around, moonlighting has always been around, especially by professionals. But platform-based work is different from freelance work. For one, the platforms take a cut from the worker's pay, a cut that can range from 15% all the way up to 50%, although most platforms are taking somewhere in the tune of about 15 to 25%. Now that's a significant portion of your pay. Most of us would be very unhappy if somebody took that much of our pay on top of taxes. But the platforms may also limit worker incomes by suggesting that they adjust their rates down in order to remain more competitive. Platforms also control interactions with clients, in many cases requiring that the interactions remain on platform or through various tools provided by the sites. A lack of responsiveness, a delivery delay, simply not accepting a sufficient number of tasks or activities on these platforms, or a series of less than perfect ratings, and the workers might find themselves punished by the algorithms, resulting in reduced work or even platform removal. And when workers are removed from the platforms, or when the platform closes, the workers are left with nothing. Unless they've developed off-platform relationships with their customers, they will lose those connections. In some cases, workers who've been removed from platforms report not even knowing if they're going to be paid for their last task or their last bit of work on the platform. Ratings, rankings, and reviews on one platform don't transfer to another. And workers who are new to another platform end up often experiencing difficulties in getting work, which means that platform workers can find themselves in a merry-go-round of entry-level status on these platforms. As work is increasingly moved to gig platforms, even those who have no interest in becoming gig workers may find that this is their only option for getting additional income or a part-time job of some sort. All of these aspects of gig work are highly problematic, but there's one group for whom gig work is often painted as especially helpful and who may have the most to lose from turning to gig work: full-time gig workers. Nearly a third of current or recent gig workers, representing about 3% of adults overall, describe gig work as their main source of employment over the past year. We find that the numbers are even higher for less affluent workers. For lower income workers, the percentages is 42%, representing 7% of all adults with lower incomes, describe gig work as their main job over the past year. We find similar numbers on the SHED survey, suggesting that while some data in the gig economy is very much open to question, that this actually seems to be a major phenomenon that's going on. Now, for these workers who are doing increased hours on the gig platforms, this often comes due to financial dependence. Nearly 60% of current or recent gig workers describe the money that they earn on the platforms as essential or important, compared to just about 39% who consider the money to be nice to have or occasionally useful. In many cases, these full-time gig workers may have turned to gig work in response to long-term unemployment, essentially turning gig work into unemployment light. Research shows that laid-off workers are less likely to apply for unemployment assistance if they have access to work via Uber. Additionally, when unemployment increases, so does the percentage of workers actively working through online platforms. The low barrier of entry and the promise of autonomy that comes with gig work can make it particularly reassuring. Craig, who is a former equity research analyst turned gig worker, illustrates this very clearly. He was desperately looking for a job. He had applied to Starbucks, he'd applied to Blockbuster, so this was several years ago, and he couldn't get any job. And then one of the elite gig platforms, he finds out about that, and he actually describes it as something that he thinks was created to take advantage of all of these underemployed or completely unemployed white-collar workers. While gig work might bring in much-needed funds after unemployment assistance expires, gig work may also serve to further promote precarity. Work by Farber, Silverman, and Von Watcher found that taking an interim job significantly reduces the likelihood of receiving a call back when interviewing for a more stable job. Even engaging in freelance work between jobs can negatively impact workers' chances of receiving future full-time employment. Richard, a former finance professional who turned to TaskRabbit, also illustrates this. He turned to gig work after a long period of unemployment, and for him it was also a salve. It was a way to sort of sit back and kind of lick his wounds because he wasn't getting any acceptances for jobs, and at least on the gig platforms he could hit accept, he could bid on things and have that sense that he was accomplishing things. Now, the opening stories of Marcus and Benjamin are examples of the implications of this long-term gig work. Gig work can be sticky. It can be difficult to transition out of it, to translate gig activities, which are often done on demand and in person, into an office or business setting. Even when the work is similar, however, workers also complain that it can be difficult to transition out, that there's often a stigma associated with gig work. One worker that I interviewed was a longtime handyman on TaskRabbit, and then he interviewed for a handyman service where the workers were paid as W-2 employees. And when he mentioned his TaskRabbit experience, they sort of laughed and they're like, no, that doesn't count. That's TaskRabbit. And he ended up not getting the job because they viewed TaskRabbit as not at the same level as the handyman service that they were offering. We also see that the jobs that workers end up getting after spending a good deal of time in the gig economy typically do not have the same level of, quote, flexibility that they've become used to. Workers, even when long-term workers say that they are relatively happy in gig work, the reason that they often give is that they are, quote, addicted to the gig work. Michael, who is a former college professor, and I have the mythical PhD doing gig work. He was a former college professor. He'd worked at some very prestigious universities as a visiting professor. He'd actually had a very well-selling book. And he ended up turning to TaskRabbit when he ended up moving to New York to be with a significant other. He was another worker who, when I met him in 2015, 2016, said, oh, this is short term, I'm gonna write a blog, I'm gonna write a book, and he was still there in 2019. And at that time, he described TaskRabbit as sort of like gambling, but the type of gambling where he believed that he had no chance of losing, although in the next breath he notes that he's also not making a whole lot of money at it. He describes it would be hard for him to leave because of the flexibility and freedom. He says that he might be addicted to it because it would be hard for him to give up doing the TaskRabbit. Going back to this idea of having a hard time giving it up and embracing this flexibility is Richard again. Richard, who lost his job in the Great Recession and ended up spending several years doing Uber driving and TaskRabbit, actually interviewed and was able to get another job that was a W-2 stable job that was sort of close to the industry he had been in previously. But it ended up being a cold calling sales job. That was the best that he could get in a company that had an incredibly high turnover rate, and he ended up quitting again very soon after, describing the reasoning as lifestyle. The gig work at least allowed him to match his schedule to that of his partner who worked in retail. Oh, I'm almost out of time? Okay. And as a result, it gave him more of a chance to be with her. How much time do I have? Oh, perfect. Oh, I got plenty of time then. And I can keep people late, right? It's like school. Oh, wow. Okay, maybe not. Now, there are solutions to the challenges of gig work. First and foremost, these gig workers are classified as independent contractors, and they shouldn't be. We don't need innovative solutions here. We have a solution. We have had generations of hard-won workplace protections. You're going to be hearing from Ruth Milkman about that shortly. We know what to do. These workers should be considered W-2 workers. They are classified as 1099 workers simply because it is a cost savings for the companies. The Committee on Ways and Means decided that it was about a 30% cost savings for companies to classify workers as independent contractors. They don't have to pay payroll taxes. They don't pay workers' comp. They don't pay unemployment insurance. They don't do contributions for health insurance, for retirement. It is an amazing cost savings for the companies. But platforms that are controlling what workers do, that control how they do it, that hold them to platform standards such as a certain make, model of car or certain cleanliness, or that require that the payments go through the platform itself, in those cases, these workers should be considered employees. If workers are not able to do the work whenever they want, that means doing their driving at 2 o'clock in the morning and having a sufficient level of work available to them at 2 o'clock in the morning, then they should be considered employees. A worker who receives reminders from a gig platform of expectations, or who is urged to behave in a particular way, such as accepting a certain portion of tasks or rides or face repercussions, should be classified as an employee. Now, it is highly likely, and in fact, indeed the case, that platforms are very much fighting this reclassification of workers. So if that reclassification cannot be handled, then we should attempt to tighten up the gap between 1099 workers and W-2 workers. One of the great challenges of independent contractor work, of gig work, is that it's outside the social safety net, the recent CARES Act aside. And so that safety net should be established for gig workers. One option would be a portable benefit program. This is something that Senator Mark Warner has introduced to Congress for years and does not seem to be moving its way forward. But this would be a good start. There should be a policy where companies have to take 3% of the task or ride and put it in a portable benefit account for the workers. Then it could be put towards retirement or towards health insurance premiums. A program like this could be helpful for both full-time and part-time gig workers. But we especially need programs to help these long-term gig workers. And one important opportunity would be to make it possible for them to transition back into W-2 employment. Gig workers are often intimately familiar with the flaws of the platforms that they work on. Anyone who has ever interviewed a gig worker who has looked at their discussion boards, they know all the problems. They know when there are outages before the tech people do. Platforms and workers could benefit from a return to management trainee and apprenticeship programs, types of programs that used to be much more common in the past. Rather than simply trot out these frontline, face-to-face gig workers for photo shoots or the occasional focus group, platforms could create 6 to 9 month apprenticeship programs that provide these frontline gig workers with an opportunity to get back into an office and to be exposed to various aspects of the company. This move would allow gig workers a much needed resume boost, providing them with employment that would likely increase the success of their job searches under the truism that an employed worker is a desirable worker. Now, some platforms actually require their corporate employees to go and work on these gig platforms at least once a month or once a quarter. In fact, DoorDash was recently in the news because one of their $400,000 a year engineers was complaining that he was having to do 12 food deliveries a year, one a month. Rather than sending out their corporate workers, who quite frankly are not going to have the same understanding or experience of doing food delivery if they have a $400,000 salary in reserve, these gig workers could be a really valuable asset in the corporate offices. Hiring a diverse class of apprentices or management trainees would help these platforms to better understand the challenges being experienced by their workers. And for the elite platform workers who wanted to return to W-2 employment, something similar could be done for them. These elite platforms could assemble ready-made classes of consultants who could go and do projects. Or these platforms are intimately familiar with the challenges experienced by both the clients and the skills of their workers, and they could establish hiring programs. Apparently out of time, so I will wrap up. The sharing economy and gig work arose in response to the Great Recession. It has harnessed technology to roll back 100 years of progress in the workplace, providing a movement forward to the past. In this so-called disruption, workers have few protections, previously protected jobs are being gigified, and there may be long-term implications for worker careers that threaten to undo workers' personal progress forward. This siren song of the gig economy promises flexibility, freedom, and full incomes. But just like the sirens in Greek mythology, they may be beckoning the unwary to disaster. And I turn it over now to Ruth.
That was great. Wonderful. Okay. So our next speaker is Professor Ruth Milkman, who is the chair of the Labor Studies Department at CUNY, as well as a distinguished professor of sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center.
Hi, everybody. My paper is really the view from 30,000 feet up and includes a lot of overlap with what you just heard, so sometimes sessions actually come together the way they're meant to. Okay, so here's a quick overview of what I'm going to try to do in my 30 minutes, is it, of the session. I start by debunking some conventional wisdom. One, the alarmist predictions of technologically driven unemployment. We've had that panic in previous eras of history, and we're having it now in some circles, and it's a myth. I'm also going to return to a theme that Michael Hout introduced earlier today of skill-based technological change, a very widely accepted claim among economists. They argue that this is a major driver of economic inequality, and I will suggest that that too is empirically problematic. And finally, what we should be more concerned about, what is alarming about new technologies, is the way in which employers have deployed them to tighten control over the labor force. The gig economy is one example of that, but there are a few others that I'll explore briefly in the time I have. So that's what I'm going to try to do in a very short amount of time. So first, if you know some economic history, or maybe even just remember, for those of us who've been around for a few decades, the panic that we've heard recently about how robots are going to take away everybody's job, the jobless future, all that, is not new. It's actually come up in many previous periods of time, including the 1930s, the 1950s. I remember as a kid hearing about this, that automation was the buzzword then, is destroying the nation. Anyway. And again in the 1980s, which is actually when robots did become widespread in manufacturing in this country, and now again in recent years. There is a kind of flip side to that fear, which is a more optimistic reading of the idea that technology is somehow going to take away jobs, which is the idea that we might have more leisure time. Paul Krugman mentioned this on the other night. There was this famous prediction by John Maynard Keynes that, quote, that the typical working week would be 15 hours by now, by the 2020s, that's the decade he mentioned, thanks to, quote, our discovery of means of economizing the use of labor, outrunning the pace at which we can find new uses for labor. And as Paul pointed out, that didn't turn out to be true. Predicting the future is kind of hard, I have to say. I've been made a fool of myself that way too in various moments, so one can sympathize. But the point is, these kinds of predictions, the jobless future, automated leisure, et cetera, have been falsified over and over again. And it is true that technology destroys certain jobs, no question about it, but it also generates new ones in various ways, including something that I guess hasn't yet been mentioned at this conference, but you probably are all familiar with, which is more and more activities that were not commodities becoming commodities. Think of dog walking and Pilates instruction, and why you could go on. Oh, this is the Keynes thing. If technology was destroying jobs, you would think that average working hours would, in fact, go down. But that hasn't happened, and nor has joblessness surged. In fact, right this minute, as you all know, we're in the midst of a unprecedented labor shortage. There is actually some evidence of an increase in average working hours in the 21st century, but I think that is actually misleading because the average figures liquidate the distinction between low-wage workers, many of whom would like to work more hours than they're offered, partly because of algorithmic scheduling, as I'll discuss in a minute, and high-wage workers who complain that they're expected to work 24/7. So that needs to be differentiated. Even though average hours have not declined, there is some evidence of a decline in the employment to population ratio, which many people think is a better measure of what's going on than unemployment statistics, which have all kinds of problems. Those did fall in the first decade of this century, suggesting perhaps a softening of aggregate demand for labor. So that's an issue that maybe we can talk about later. So that may be happening, but it has not been driven by technology. ICT stands for Information and Communication Technologies. There's a lot of different factors driving the employment to population ratio decline, which is quite modest, by the way, but it's there. One of them is lagging female labor force participation, which is often attributed in this country to the lack of things like paid family leave and decent child care at affordable prices and so on, which changes the calculation for some, especially married women, about whether to participate in the labor force. Limited immigration, which was mentioned yesterday, is another one. And then also the retirement of my generation. I'm resisting doing this myself personally, but the baby boomers have, that contributes to, since we live longer, lower employment to population ratios, and population does include people over 65. Okay. Another big driver, which I guess we haven't really discussed that much here, but maybe we should, is the shift in the center of the economy from manufacturing to services. In the service sector, these new technologies seem to have more limited applicability, as I guess it was Robert Gordon talked about this yesterday. And meanwhile, the impact of new technology in manufacturing, continues, but is actually tapering off. I read recently this book by Aaron Benavieve that I was very taken with, which argues that the potential for productivity growth via technology or other means is very limited inherently in service work. If you think about something like home care, which is projected by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics to be one of the fastest growing occupations in the coming decades, it's very hard to imagine how that would be impacted significantly by by any kind of technology, actually, other than maybe lifting devices. Well, anyway. The other thing that's interesting about this is that, contrary to, counterintuitively, countries like Germany that actually have done more robotization in their factories than the United States have actually lost fewer jobs than we have, because worldwide manufacturing has a lot of overcapacity. And if you want to capture some of the market, it's actually better to be more efficient. And, so there's all kinds of complicated stuff going on here. I'll talk a minute about skill-based technological change and why that's a problematic way of looking at it. One reason is that new technologies do generate some skilled jobs, those software engineers and so on, but they also generate huge numbers of low-wage, less skilled ghost jobs. We heard about TaskRabbit yesterday. Think of all those Amazon delivery people who, that's coming off of an app or a new technology, the existence of Amazon, but there's a lot of low-skilled, low-wage work that's generated by all that. Oh, so here we heard about this from somebody yesterday. I can't remember who talked about it, but Mechanical Turk is sort of an extreme example where the of the ghost jobs. That term was invented by someone, Mary Gray, and I've forgotten her co-author's name. Does anybody remember? Sorry. In a book called Ghost Work, where they document the sort of low profile but very extensive work generated by platforms. So Mechanical Turk is one of those that will pay you to visually identify, is this a parking meter or whatever, to improve AI visualization, and it pays next to nothing. What am I doing wrong? Oh, okay. All right, so let me turn to this problem of skill-based technological change briefly. How am I doing for time? What does that mean? How many? Okay, well, thank you. Okay, so the argument that many proponents of this view, most of them academic economists, but it's also very present in the popular conversations about these matters, argue that new technologies offer an inherent advantage to workers with more education and skill. Well, Michael sort of demolished that already this morning, so maybe I don't have to go into detail, but the basic argument is that the more skilled the job is, the harder it is to automate, and also the sort of second argument they make is that people who are better at using the new technologies and the new tools can command, higher incomes as a result. You've all heard some version of this. It's everywhere. And this is also often invoked to explain the college wage premium, which you saw the data on a little while ago, and rising inequality more generally, which of course is a huge problem that we have now. In my view, the most rigorous elaboration of this claim is the book called The Race Between Education and Technology by Claudia Golden and Larry Katz. And what they argue, which is a little different from the popular version, is that it's basically a question of whether, the race, it involves the degree to which education is sort of keeping up with the demand for skill. So they argue that prior to 1980, from World War II to 1980, when things like the GI Bill and other changes propelled a huge increase in the share of the workforce that did have college education, in that period, they say education won the race, but then the growth in educational attainment slows after 1980, along with all the other things that changed then, even as new technology takes off. So then they say technology won the race. So for them, it's about the supply of highly educated workers, not the demand for them, that explain changing inequality. So that, as far as it goes, makes a lot of sense. I still think it's not really the explanation, and I think Michael's paper gives us further evidence to that point. There are many other things driving inequality that are much more important. And they sort of acknowledge some of these sort of in passing. All these articles and books have a paragraph somewhere where they say, oh yeah, unions have declined in density, and that's important, and the minimum wage has not kept up with inflation, and there's deregulation, and there's tax cuts for the rich, which we've seen a few times in my lifetime, changing norms of executive compensation, which Krugman mentioned the other night, globalization. They have this long list of stuff, but no, in the end, they say it's technology that matters. Sorry, I didn't mean for that to go away. The main cause of skyrocketing inequality, the residual, as Michael Hout pointed out, is technology. But this claim has become increasingly the subject of critique. And so I'm just going to walk very quickly through those, because I do have a whole other thing I want to say in my remaining time. One thing that has been pointed out, Occupy Wall Street spotlighted the gap between the 1%, and it's really more like the 1/10 of 1%, but anyway, and everybody else. Skill-based technological change cannot explain that. Others argue, including famously Thomas Piketty, that top corporate executives now have the power to set their own compensation. We all know these spectacular salaries plus stock options plus everything else that they enjoy. More generally, professionals and managers have gained more bargaining power, even as low-wage workers that were once protected by labor unions and other institutions have fallen apart. This is just one more study in the list that Michael gave us, a longer list of that shows that earnings have actually risen more for people with so-called managerial and analytic skills than for computer-related skills, which are often seen as like the key to making it in this new economy. And then there are the low-wage jobs the ghost jobs I already mentioned, warehouse work, care work of other kinds that are not subject to automation, at least not yet. And so they should command an earnings premium according to SBTC, right? Because they can't be automated, just like being a fancy analyst can't be automated so easily, and yet they remain at the bottom of the labor market. Another critique that's out there is that while the college premium remains, as we saw earlier in this session, the real wages of college graduates in the 21st century have actually stagnated, and yet inequality has continued to skyrocket. So that's another problem with the theory. So I'm rushing a little bit because I know you said I had plenty of time, but I got plenty more to say. I want to just give you a few snapshots of what I think we really should be worrying about when we think about technology and its impact on workers, and that is the ways in which employers have mobilized technology to degrade work. I think there are a bunch of reasons for this. One, and those are in the slide. The narrow focus on supply and demand misses the qualitative shifts that are underway, some of which are pretty dramatic, as Alexandria's paper illustrates. And then there's the sort of shiny object problem. We're all like fascinated by the dazzling potentials of new technologies, our phones and all that. And I think people have forgotten some very basic facts about the structural dynamics of capitalism, which has not gone away, and along with the accumulated effects of soaring inequality and union decline. So new technologies have been mobilized to reinforce the power of employers at labor's expense, is what I'm basically saying. So I'm just going to give you a few examples. One is scheduling algorithms. This is not the gig economy yet. I'll get to that. But in retail and hospitality for decades now, employers have figured out how, at a very low cost, thanks to scheduling algorithms, to coordinate the hours of their employees to fluctuations in customer volume. So, a department store gets an influx of customers at lunchtime and at 5 o'clock, at least historically. You can kind of therefore have more people on your payroll during those periods of time than at 3 in the afternoon. Restaurants have done this for a long time. Weather forecasts are in the equation, holidays, all kinds of things. And this, of course, saves employers a lot of money because instead of having people standing around all day, some of the hours in which they're idle, they're only there for times when there's a lot of business. And also, this helps them minimize overtime pay, which employers hate. There is this law back from 1938 that you have to pay people time and a half for overtime, so one solution is to just not have overtime. So the result, and it's similar to the gig economy that Alexandria described, employers often maintain, these sectors have for decades now, maintained huge pools of workers who are basically on call. Most of them with quite limited hours, as I mentioned before. Many of them would prefer to work more hours than they're actually offered. So we ask the question, flexibility for whom? It's touted as flexibility, but in fact, the flexibility is pretty much all on the employer side in this example. And it renders many workers' lives very unstable and unpredictable. Think about if you're a working mom, which in hospitality and retail, there are lots of workers who fit that description, and you're trying to arrange childcare and you have no idea what your schedule's going to be in the next 2 weeks. This is not flexibility. It's kind of more like chaos. So all the market risk is transferred from employers to workers in this example. And, well, there's a lovely study by a guy called Alex Wood over in the UK who studies this scheduling stuff, and he talks about another dimension of the way in which this intensifies managerial control, because the most compliant workers, he shows, are kind of favored by the managers and then offered the best hours. He calls them scheduling gifts. So this encourages workers to not make a fuss, not be uppity, whatever you want to call it, because then maybe they'll get the schedule they prefer, more likely. So there's a bunch of people who've done work on this, you can see in the white there. Okay, so a second snapshot. Workplace surveillance. I don't think it's been mentioned at this conference, but Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism is one of my favorite reads of the last couple years. And she has shown that that data collection via new technology on all of us in all kinds of ways is a new form of capital accumulation that she argues is driving the modern economy. But she focuses her gaze mostly on consumers, the way Alexa is listening to you in your living room and that kind of thing, not so much on the workplace. But this is happening in the workplace too, and other scholars have begun to document that. It's everywhere. Hiring decisions are now based on algorithms, people analytics, they call it. So just to get a job, and maybe this is related to what Alexandrea was talking about, surveillance of data collection on us of various kinds is underway. And then in the workplace, there's electronic monitoring of what people are doing once they are hired. Everything from the keystrokes, the number of keystrokes they log, what websites they browse. Employers can read your email if you use a corporate account, by the way, including in universities, as you may know. Clocking the amount of time somebody spends with a patient or a client, timing the time, that's kind of horrible English, I'm sorry. Clocking the time that you spend in the bathroom or on a break. All this is very enabled by the new technologies, and employers are doing it. So one example is the trucking industry, which has been kind of destroyed from what was once seen as a pretty good job for someone without a lot of education to a really terrible one. You probably read about this in the news. It's been transformed further by what does it stand for? EOBRs? Here we go. Electronic onboard recorders, which were invented a while ago, and many trucking companies started using them. And they do have a positive function, which is safety. None of us want truck drivers to be asleep at the wheel, obviously, and so this is one way of helping to guard against that, and that's why they've become mandatory in the United States, and actually earlier in Europe for the last couple of years. But this technology doesn't just record how many hours the trucker is driving, or whether the truck is moving or not, but all kinds of other things: speed, idling time, where they are. And the dispatchers of the trucking companies can just monitor the drivers in real time in a very comprehensive way. There's a great sociologist called Karen Levy who's documented this in detail, and this is just one quote from one of her publications. Even when drivers are off duty, employers can see where they are, can contact them even while they're asleep. So this is the panopticon to the nth degree. And that's just one example. It's happening in a lot of other fields as well. So this obviously enhances management's control over workers. Surveillance is not new. This goes way back to the beginnings of capitalism, but it's much cheaper and easier with the new technologies. And workers, I should mention, just do find ways to evade it. So Karen Levy, who I mentioned a minute ago, shows that sometimes truckers figure out how to remove the fuses temporarily from the machine to disable it so they can get a nap or whatever. So it's not, foolproof, but this is a big piece of what's happening in the workplace. And, in old-fashioned terms, you might say that this helps employers maximize the labor they extract from labor power, if you'll pardon the Marxist jargon. Okay, so now my favorite topic of the day is Amazon, which I think all of us are riveted to, or anyway I am, after the events of last week. So the warehouses, including the one in Staten Island, but there are many, many others around the country and the world, exemplify the exploitation of new technology to speed up work, along with surveillance. Whoops. So Amazon warehouse workers have explicit quotas of how many items they're supposed to pick and sort per minute, and this is tracked automatically. Famously, Amazon also tracks something called time off task, any time apart from the scheduled breaks that these workers have spent away from the workstation, including going to the bathroom. So you've heard the stories of people peeing in bottles because they don't have time to go to the bathroom. Not just at Amazon, by the way, that's become quite common in other fields as well, including gig workers. So if you fail to keep up with the quotas and maybe you have too much time off task, there's a system that can progressive discipline. Again, an old phenomenon, nothing new. Amazon warehouses are basically like factories, right? So factories often had progressive discipline too. The difference is, in the old days, it was done by human beings. Now it's done by algorithms, and you can be disciplined or even terminated without any contact with a human supervisor. So you have no opportunity to explain why you needed to be in the bathroom for a half hour or whatever it is. The system generates electronic warnings and eventually termination notices. Lately, Amazon has added another twist with, this came up yesterday, I guess, what they call FC games. one of the problems Amazon has is really high turnover, around 150%, which is quite high, despite their relatively decent wages. That turnover is really expensive, and so they would like to do something about that. So one of the things they would like to do is have the work be less boring, and so they've introduced these video games. This is not required. It's just there if you want to do it, that pickers and stowers can play while they're doing their boring jobs. And this, too, is fully automated. The Washington Post, a reporter, describes this a little bit. As robots wheel, my spacing got all screwed up here, sorry. As robots wheel giant shelves up to each workstation, that's what the robots do, by the way. They don't do the actual picking and sorting. Lights or screens indicate which item the worker needs to put into a bin. The games can register the completion of the task, tracked by scanning devices, and can pit individuals, teams, or entire floors in a race to pick or stow Lego sets, cell phone cases, dish soap. Doesn't it sound exciting? I don't mean to make fun of it, because if you're stuck in a job like this probably is very enticing compared to the alternative, which is utter boredom, right? So you can see why people get seduced into this. And then they get points and various minor goodies throughout their shift. So Alexandrea also already gave us a very good description of platform work, so maybe I should skip this, but I just want to point out that it combines all the elements I've already talked about. Algorithmic scheduling, electronic surveillance, and gamification are all part of the mix in these jobs. So I think I should skip this because I must be short of time by now. We can talk about it in more detail later, but I think we've covered this already, thanks to Alexandrea. I do want to mention one amazing description of, you probably know this piece by Sarah Mason about Lyft, about gamification in her experience. She says, every Sunday morning, this is a sociologist actually, she's a graduate student at UC Santa Cruz, but she worked for a while as a Lyft driver. There we go again, another example of what Michael told us is rare, but it does happen. And so she described what happened. She said, every Sunday morning I get an algorithmically generated challenge from Lyft that goes something like this. Complete 34 rides between 5 a.m. on Monday and 5 a.m. on Sunday to receive a bonus of $63. Click here. I tap the screen to accept. Now when I log into driver mode, a meter will appear showing my progress. Only 21 more rides before I hit my bonus. So, that's part of the mix. I was part of a team that did a study of Instacart workers, and one of them mentioned, she said to us, I feel kind of like I'm playing a slot machine, figuring out what jobs are most advantageous to take. So this is embedded in the platform work. So again, I've already said this, I'm just going to summarize. Both the predictions that we hear about the impact of new technology on work, about a jobless future, or that, all that really matters is getting a lot of education so you can escape the effects of all this, are not really consistent with the evidence available. And again, we should be more concerned about the use of new technologies to degrade labor and enhance employer power. So I'll just stop there. Thank you. Oh, can I just show one more slide? I forgot about this. Employers are using, this was added, this is not in the paper. Employers are using technology to fight back. So this victory last week of the Amazon Labor Union, they used a lot of new technology in their campaign, including crowdfunding through GoFundMe. They used TikTok to document things like Chris Smalls being arrested in front of the plant. They have a Telegram chat, so that is the other side, which I haven't really studied in any detail, but every action has a reaction. So so now I really will stop. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much for that great presentation on the technologically driven economy. So we're going to have a commentary now, and where Dr. Frida Polli will be joining us for a commentary. Dr. Polli is a CEO of Pymetrics, which is a firm that actually does automated hiring based in AI algorithms. I'm not sure I'll do this justice, which matches jobs with applicants on the basis of specialized behavioral and cognitive assessments. So welcome to the conference and the stage, and thank you so much.
So hi, I'm Frida. I used to be in academia. I was a cognitive scientist at Harvard and MIT for a decade. And then I transitioned out of academia through the MBA program at Harvard. That's where I saw recruiting firsthand, realized that what was missing from the equation often was trying to understand people more holistically, so not just assuming that their resume was kind of the be-all, end-all. And so as a cognitive scientist, we collectively as a community had developed all sorts of tools to basically measure cognitive, social, and emotional aptitudes in people. And so that is the technology that we offer. I wouldn't call it automation in any way more than so I should say Joe Fuller, if you guys are you familiar with anyone? No? Joe Fuller did this great, he's at the business school at Harvard, he did this great piece of work called Missing Workers. And really what he showed was that starting in the 1990s when platforms like Indeed and ZipRecruiter and LinkedIn, I guess, or the precursor to that, Monster and all those, started sending 250 people for every job opening, employers started responding with automation, right? And so that automation has actually been going on for decades, mostly in the form of keyword searches in resumes. And unfortunately, that keyword search in resumes is highly discriminatory towards all of the underrepresented people that you would imagine, because resumes tend to track your privilege, your gender, your race, and all the rest of it. So we're no more or less automated than some of these tools that have been around since the 1990s, in the sense that we don't replace humans. We are a layer that people use in addition to whatever they're using to look at resumes to help employers and also candidates and employees get a more holistic view of themselves, using their sort of, who they are as human beings rather than just what's on their resume. And again, that's usually used in combination with the resume. The vast majority of folks that use us to increase diversity. So the reason we increase diversity, and I don't just mean gender and ethnicity, I mean socioeconomic, neurodiversity, age diversity, is because the features that we measure using cognitive science are equitably distributed. So you could actually benchmark off of a primarily Caucasian, primarily male workforce and find those attributes in people of color and in women at equal rates. So that's the difference between the data that we use and the data that's on a resume. If you benchmark off of white men's resumes, you actually won't find any women or people of color that have those same criteria. So that's the problem with resumes. So that's what pymetrics does. And again, I wouldn't say 100%, but close to 100% of the employers that use us to improve or maintain diversity, and as a sort of mediator to some of the problems they see with resume-based hiring. And we certainly don't automate anything other than that initial phase of when someone's dropping a resume, and then some process is being used by the company to decide who to invite to an interview. So just wanted to make that clear. So I had a lot of thoughts about what you guys were talking about. I thought the last presentation, maybe it's the recency effect, but potentially had, I thought that was really interesting what you were talking about. I think I just have a couple of comments. So, I think the automation of all of these processes, I think your comment that, you heard about it in the 1950s and the 1980s, it's nothing new. And so I think lumping all of automation together is not helpful, because there are some aspects of automation, and I would include us in the picture, that actually can improve social equity. And then there's lots of others that don't. So I don't think that automation being one thing or another thing is necessarily accurate. And, it's a continual fight. And actually what we see is that, so there have been meta-analyses done of humans reviewing resumes over the last 30 years. It's called audit studies, where you submit the same resume to a firm. And, again, for every 10, so exact same resume, for every 10 John Williams that get hired, how many Jamals and Juans do you think get hired? Same resume. It's seven Jamals and 8 Juans, right? So again, that's the baseline, that's the backdrop. Versus what we see when we use our system, it's basically a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of Caucasians versus African Americans versus Hispanics. So we're actually outperforming what human beings can do. And that was kind of what got me interested in building pymetrics. Is as a cognitive scientist, you just, you study the human brain, human decision making, you realize how flawed it is, and you think, okay, well-designed tools, machines, whatever, can actually do better. Now, that message isn't very resonant with the general public. Although we are known in the field as being an unbiased tool. And so I think people are starting to come around to the idea that there could be some tools that exist that are like that. Really just depends on the tool. Another, sort of perspective I have is we've been quite active in the policy space, so we have been advocating for more regulation in the space, which again might seem surprising, but my perspective is that if you're building it correctly, you should actually want to be interrogated, because then you can showcase it's like a competitive advantage, right? If I can show that I'm unbiased versus all the other tools that aren't, it's actually, it's a market advantage. So I actually want more scrutiny in our space. And so we've been working with regulators in New York, at the federal level, and in New York City. I don't know if you guys know this, there was a law that was recently passed that's going into effect in January 2023, which will make it illegal for tools any automated tool, doesn't matter if it's a basic resume parser or anything, to be used unless it's been subject to a bias audit. And we were actually fairly instrumental in having that, having that happen, because we feel that, again, at the end of the day, there's a lot of, so I don't know how much you guys have been tracking the EU regulations. My perspective is it's fine to ask every single question you could possibly ask of a system, and but that's a little bit like, if I just want to understand if a car is emitting carbon dioxide, do I really need to know what's going on in the engine? I don't really need to. I just need to stick the thing on the tailpipe and measure it, right? And that's my perspective, is that it's all fine and dandy to measure all these things, but I think it's potentially overly complicated, and all we need really is reporting on things we care about. So we care about racial bias, we care about gender bias, we care about discrimination against age, against disabilities, and maybe there's some other things I haven't mentioned, right? But I think if you're testing that, think of like the output of an algorithm as a exhaust pipe. If you're measuring the exhaust pipe for those types of biases, then I personally think that gets you the vast majority of the way there, So we've been pushing for more and more sort of not process audits, but outcome audits. Yeah, so those are just my general comments, and I'm happy to answer questions if you guys have them, or I don't know how you guys want to do this, but I definitely didn't have slides. I'm sorry, I was going to wing it.
Oh, and Peter, that's right. So actually, why don't you come
perfect.
up on the
Okay.
stage, and then
Should
you
I
can
step down?
engage
Oh.
with Dr. Polli, and then we can have the questions. So we'll have the Q&A after the course. Dr. Peter Asaro is the director of the graduate program and the associate professor of media studies at the New School, where he studies the ethical dimensions of algorithms and data.
Great, thank you. So my background is really in philosophy and computer science. I've worked in robotics and automation, did a lot of work on the history of cybernetics. So I appreciate a lot of the historical context that's been given around all these issues, and I'm going to try to put on my philosophy of technology hat. This semester I'm also teaching a seminar on big tech and society. So a lot of this I'm going to filter through sort of a notion of what big tech is, which, apart from just the technology, of course, are these massively wealthy, massively powerful corporate institutions, many of which are now worth more than $1 trillion in terms of market capitalization, which exceeds what many governments and countries and states have access to. But they also have a profound power to shape our lives through the technologies that they produce, whether you're talking about a Google or an Amazon or Microsoft or Apple, or now even Tesla is now a $1 trillion company. They're not just like the GMs of the 1960s selling us a product that is a car that's a useful piece of transportation. But these are systems that are shaping social relations in profound ways. And what we've seen in this panel today and the panel yesterday afternoon, how it's transforming labor and work in particular. So I'll try to focus more on those aspects of it today. And I think in terms of the tech unemployment as sort of putting everybody out of work, we saw some good economic reasons why that's highly unlikely. And yet what we do see are very specific areas of work being eliminated, being replaced, the transformation of labor in very profound ways, both on factory floors and in warehouses and in offices and in the creation of gig work, although musicians have been doing gig work for quite a long time before there was software. And so many of these things are not new, but I think when we look to technology and particularly automation and artificial intelligence, what we're looking at is an amplification of many of these trends that we've seen in capitalism over the last few centuries. And we can think of it as sort of automation or technology on steroids. AI is really just statistics on steroids in many respects, which can make it very powerful and very useful. But we also have to think very much about the context in which it's being built. And we had heard a little bit about technological determinism and why we shouldn't be too worried about that, and I think that's right. We also shouldn't be too worried about social determinism. So the technology itself doesn't shape the world. Society and its values are shaping technology. At the same time, that's not an infinite flexibility and plasticity. There are physical limitations, there are economic, mathematical, computational limitations, and even within the social realm, there are social, political norms and limitations, and as far as how we can shape a technology or reshape society in various ways. But with information communication technologies in particular, and what we might call the fourth Industrial Revolution, we have way more flexibility and power than we've ever had before to shape these things, which is also an opportunity to make them better and to make society better. But there's these forces that, left to their own means, are going to sort of operate in their own interests. So I think it's helpful to think of Langdon Winter's piece of wisdom that technology is neither good nor bad nor neutral. And at some point it's functioning towards somebody's values, and it's generally the values of the people who build that technology. And so we see Taylorism, again, sort of Taylorism on steroids in the creation of this gig work. We see de-skilling, we see surveillance and tracking of employees. But what we also see, especially in these big tech and kind of unicorn applications that we're talking about, like Uber or Airbnb, is technologies that are literally designed to redistribute wealth, right? So we shouldn't at all be surprised that they have this effect of redistributing wealth. Uber is trying to, take a piece of taxi revenue from every city around the world simultaneously without actually owning any cars. And they've sort of pulled it off to some extent and remarkably have not been profitable at doing that. And so that actually should raise lots of questions about what kind of business is this exactly. So part of this is about geographic, right, redistribution of wealth, which we've seen at outsourcing in the 1980s and 90s as well, where jobs move around. But what ICT lets us do is put jobs anywhere in the world to some extent. And that also, though, allows the companies that control the platforms to extract wealth from all over the place, even though they're located in a specific place. It allows a very small number of software developers in Silicon Valley to yield a vast amount of wealth and resources as a result of that. And to some extent, we've seen with, say, gig work, where certain experiments in Arkansas, where they try to train low-income individuals to become part of the gig economy. They find very quickly, if you're in a rural area, you don't have access to the internet, you don't have the skills to operate computers, you don't have many of the customers that would use the gig applications. So these are not useful for, say, lifting people out of poverty everywhere. They're mostly used and concentrated in urban areas and things like that. So geography still matters to a large extent. And as we saw, the way in which low wages and low skills don't exactly correlate. Many of the jobs that we consider low skill, low wage turn out to be very difficult to automate. Cleaning a toilet is incredibly difficult for a robot. So is folding laundry. But we don't pay people who do that work very much. And a lot of the work that's done by, say, white-collar workers is quite easy to automate. Even though they get paid a lot of money and they require high levels of education, we can automate a lot of that, like we see in lawyers and paralegals doing discovery, things like that. So to some extent, these values that we have as social values don't really map directly to what technologies are capable of or how they can be reshaped. And in Bjornson and McAfee, we also see the ways in which technologies don't necessarily displace work, but also create certain types of elite workers, which we might even think of as sort of cyborg elite workers, those who are able to mobilize the technologies, not just sort of as an individual person, but entire vast networks. And I work in media studies, and the media industry is a giant information technology industry. And over the 20th century, we can see quite clearly like how artists, musicians, actors used to have lots of jobs all over the place because you had to go to a theater, you had to go to a music hall, you needed live performance with recording of music, eventually images, film, all the way up to, say, the Beatles, where you get concerts where you can have tens of thousands of people. You wind up with these celebrities who are capable of getting vast amounts of money for their performances because they can do it at these vast scales. And there's very few of them, where there used to be many, many more musicians who could make a living as a musician, and now there's many fewer, but they make a lot more money. We see this in sports. We see this in acting and cinema and all sorts of other elite jobs. And to some extent, we could argue this happens in financialization and hedge fund managers and bank CEOs as well, who are able to control what I would call socio-technical networks. So it's not purely technology, it's not purely social, these are hybrid systems, socio-technical systems. And if you position them, or you position yourself in the right place within such a system, you can extract vast amounts of wealth and power. And people try to build systems specifically to do that. So the question is, how do we organize labor, power, government, citizens, users, consumers, to offset that kind of power, to reorganize these systems, to enhance their usability, to enhance the quality of the society that they wind up producing. And in the context of workers, of course, we have a long history with unionization. We're seeing revivals of that in Amazon after many decades of a country that's established policies to try to break up unions, right to work states. Also just recategorizing workers as both part-time, so you don't have to give them full-time benefits, you restrict the number of hours, then you make them independent contractors, or then you get Proposition 22 in California to create a whole new class of workers that can't even sort of attempt to organize without some crazy vote by the legislature. But and this is an attempt, obviously, to roll back many of the advantages that workers have been able to fight for and establish over many, many years, putting them back at square one. But of course, it doesn't have to be that way. Right, and if we look at gig work and Uber as an example with drivers, we can also look at Rideshare Austin, right, which is not a worker-owned cooperative necessarily. It was established as a nonprofit, built a platform, works just like Uber, but all the profits that come out of that go back into benefits for the drivers. So they get health care, and they get time off, and they get things like that. And why shouldn't they, right? They're doing the work. Why should that labor be expropriated and its value transferred to Silicon Valley, where they already have plenty of wealth? So we could have different models of this. What we're also seeing is workers who traditionally didn't organize, particularly tech workers. In the Tech Worker Coalition, we've seen walkouts at Google, as well as Microsoft, to some degree at Amazon as well. Very highly paid workers, very privileged in a certain sense within the working conditions, but they're still fighting and arguing for greater control and say in how their companies operate. So this was, in the case of Google, initially around sexual harassment and gender discrimination, but very quickly moved into questions about Project Maven, where they were assisting the US military in designing artificial intelligence for targeting systems and drones, which is an area I work in. but also in whether or not the company would capitulate to Chinese demands to censor searches on Google search within China. It is extended to a number of other issues. At Microsoft, it was whether they would supply software to the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, who were imprisoning children in cages at the time. And so we see them asking really for respect for a greater level of social value, thinking about corporate values and interests, and are those beneficial to society? And that's not something we've seen historically in labor union movements more traditionally. We've also seen a growth in things around, say, shareholder activism in companies like Shell, where investors will buy enough shares and then try to pressure the company into changing their ethics to get out of carbon-based fuels and things like that. So there are these sort of other mechanisms for holding corporations, especially of this power and scale, accountable, and some of that's going to come from the workers themselves, hopefully. About 25 years ago, I wrote a paper on the history of participatory design. And so I've also heard lots of echoes of that paper over the last 2 days. And this was a movement around that began at the Norwegian mining companies in the 1960s, and then moved into the British Tavistock Institute for Social Relations. And they were really sort of looking at how automation was being integrated into the workplace. And the assumption being that, well, of course, the capitalists were imposing it, and what if we took a labor model in which workers would collectively bargain for better technologies in the workplace, and then how do we go about designing those technologies so that labor unions could ask for them, because they don't exist and the customers are always the capitalists, so technologies get built for the owners of capital, not the workers. And it turns out, you can try to design technology to prevent de-skilling, to enhance autonomy, to increase job satisfaction. And that works to a certain extent. The labor model doesn't always work as well as they hoped. There's many problems with this, but this basic idea has transformed. It wound up at Xerox PARC for quite a while, at IBM as well, and thinking about how do we integrate the users of systems into technological design. And I think there's a lot that we still need to think about for that, and think about not just the users, but the consumers, the citizens, the society itself. How do we relate or integrate the values that we actually want into these systems over time? And then just a few comments on the papers this morning. So in terms of education, of course, the mass of de-skilling or job displacement that we see from technology, how do we respond to this with education? So on the one hand, we need to think very much about retraining jobs that get displaced, ones that we can see coming. The driverless car is going to displace drivers. What are those drivers going to do instead? How do we train them to do other things? How do we think about lifelong learning and upskilling when we know that technology is going to continue to change much more rapidly than generations of individuals are going to go to college? We need to be able to retrain. And as an educator and somebody who runs the largest media studies program in the country, I've seen a dramatic change in what skills students bring in. So when I started a decade ago, most students didn't have any experience with nonlinear video editing or shooting digital video on their own, editing it on a computer. That's my 15 minutes, oops. But now almost every student has done some degree of this, right? So these technologies proliferate. It means we have to sort of step up our game in terms of what does it mean to professionalize making video. But that also means we can focus on narrative and storytelling and how to make compelling stories, and not just how to use the tech. And we have to get beyond thinking about training and education as using tools and thinking about teaching people how to learn, how to tell stories, and how to make meaning and change in the world. And I think that's a future that we have to really invest in. In terms of the gig economy, I think I covered a lot of that. I mean, a lot of these systems, of course, we have to realize were designed also to be disruptive of society. They wanted to change society. They wanted to redirect flows of capital to their pockets. And they wanted to disempower workers and make work more precarious so they could pay less. And they want to, extract more wealth and efficiency out of these systems. But it doesn't always work that way, thankfully. But we need to think a lot about who owns these. And right now, we've just relied on this model of venture capital investing in startups that allow them to create these vast amounts of startup capital that lets a company like Uber essentially try to create a monopoly in every cab market around the world simultaneously by underselling. They're not making a profit, they're losing massive amounts of money. The idea being, once all the other taxi companies go out of business, they're gonna jack up the prices. Thankfully, I think other companies like Lyft and things like that will prevent them from achieving monopoly. So eventually that model might fall apart. Amazon, I think, was sort of the company that demonstrated that model, having many, many years of no profits and now having these sort of astronomical profits. But a lot of that was also about avoiding taxation and things like that. But that's become a viable kind of model. We need to think about, is that the way that we want to actually invest and develop technologies going forward? We can think about, and it's been proposed around a particularly gig worker markets to make it a public utility. What would that look like? What would it look like to be a nonprofit like Rideshare Austin, or a worker-owned cooperative? And I think these are all viable models, and we need to think about, as a society, how do we invest in and promote the creation of those? I don't know that we always want government to control these markets, but they can certainly be worker-owned cooperatives and nonprofits who can establish in different areas of specialization and work different models and platforms that are effective. And of course, surveillance capitalism, one of my favorite topics. But I think that's a clear example where the disproportionate access and control of the technology is obvious. And this runs through not just the whole kind of advertising market that Shoshana Zuboff focuses on in that book, but all of AI. What matters is who has the data. And if you have all the data, then you control the ability to do things with that data. And as individuals, we can't compete in any way with these big tech companies. Their ability to collect data is unfathomable, even compared to other kinds of startups and things like that, much less individuals, citizens, or governments in many cases. So we really need to think about how to equalize that, how to control and regulate the acquisition and use of data. I think we need to radically rethink privacy. It's not just like, I give you consent and now you own my data and you can do whatever you want with it. That has to be conditioned. What you can do with my data is highly conditional on the context in which I grant you access to it. And of course, whenever we have algorithmic decision making, we have to think about transparency, accountability, responsibility. How do these things work? How do we know that they're reliable or biased, and can we check that? And that we always have, at some level, a right to appeal algorithmic decisions. And so most of my work has been at the United Nations trying to get a ban on autonomous weapons systems, or lethal autonomous weapons. And there, the decision is to kill a human being. And that is not something that you can appeal afterwards. So I think there are also cases in which human values, human dignity itself, says that there are just technologies you cannot produce. There are algorithms that are not acceptable in society. Those that are have to be subject to the regulations, the transparency, the accountability, and then we can accept those into society, and others are off limits. So, thank you.
Great. So, Martine, why don't you start us off with a question?
Part of this is going to look like a comment, which it is, and it will ask for some information, much of which you did not address today, and there were more specifics. But since I have experts in the area of technology on the one hand, I guess I like what you thought about what I'm going to ask. Since this session of the conference is on social consequences of technology, it's not unique for most of you concentrated on those things that had to do with the economy, and not necessarily a lot of things that had to do with socially, that is their time and other things that were on outside. I'd like you to actually give some comments on this, because we have this critical mass on just the economy, which is only on what you would do at a job or what you do in terms of education towards an occupation, but not in terms of the broader sense of what these technologies are. And I guess I'd like to give some sense, because over the time, there's got to be some good things that have happened in technology and the social world, rather than all the bloody bad things that we've actually been discussing for the 2 days. So I'd like you to give some comment, and some of my suggestions would be something that's similar to this, which we might take as being terribly unpalatable, but we're watching a war, and we're watching a war in Ukraine, and technology is involved, and we have two types of bombs, and we know that they exist, and they're technologically oriented. One they're calling the dumb bomb, and one they're calling the smart bomb, all on technology. One kills in more mass, one kills with one more specific, or doesn't have to kill if it's specific. That's just one thing which technology has an enormous effect on social life as it goes on. That's a bad thing. But I'm also thinking about health. Lots of technology has improved health, or even in social engagement. You're alone, you're a widower like me, you want to find somebody. Technology has helped that, rather than just to run into somebody at the bus station or something. So, in other words, yes.
Well, I can talk about the weapons. That's my field. Yes, often our campaign against killer robots is accused of trying to ban precision-guided munitions because they make certain kinds of decisions about navigation to a target and things like that, which we're not doing, because ultimately what we're concerned about is whether there's a human making the targeting decision and whether they're legally and morally responsible for that decision and can be held accountable for it. But what we do see, even in this Ukrainian conflict, where Russia actually has many more precision munitions than the Ukraine, it's also about what they choose to target. So the precision is only as good as your willingness, not to kill civilians. And if part of your goal is to punish civilians, then it doesn't matter how technologically sophisticated, you're actually just helping them more precisely kill civilians by adding precision in that kind of case. But I think ultimately we have these systems of legal responsibility for war crimes, crimes against humanity, things like that we want to be enforceable against countries and against officers and soldiers who engage in that. And if you are delegating those decisions to machines, that's going to be far more difficult. It's already very difficult to hold anybody accountable for war crimes. It would be even more so if those decisions were being automated. Yeah, but I think that only goes to the point of the targeting decision. But you don't want, even though that you could argue perhaps, cognitively we could enhance human targeting decision making by automating it, but that's theoretical, not real, and I think there's real reasons not to do that.
Can I just add a couple points, which because I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying. I think technology does have all sorts of potential benefits. The problem is the system of power that it's embedded in. So, an old example of this, I remember when word processing first began. I don't know about you guys, I typed my dissertation on a typewriter, and then when I wrote the book, I started using a computer. So, and I'm a very obsessive person, so when I was using a typewriter, I would retype things endlessly because I didn't like having mistakes on the page. Anyway, that's my problem maybe, but it was a great advance for people like us who fool around with words for a living, right? It made our lives much easier. But that same technology used in corporate workplaces had a completely different effect, right? So that's the issue. I think you said it very well in talking about socio-technical systems. So it's not that technology is evil in some inherent way. It's a matter of who's controlling it and what it's being used for. So, sure, there are some good things about it. I mean, I also did some research in 2011 on Occupy Wall Street, and at that time, this is history now, but the protesters were so much more adept, mostly because they were quite young, at using Twitter and all the other social media technologies than the cops. That's over. They know the cops are on top of it now. But so that was, in my view, a very positive use of new technology, although, you know, things have moved on. So sure, it's got all kinds of positive sides, but our job is to be social critics, I thought.
Can I just say, I don't mean that. That's not what I asked.
Oh, okay. Maybe I misunderstood.
I guess what I meant is something like this. The telephone came up, and we all know it's controlled by a number of people like AT&T. But in addition of what control meant, it had a number of social sorts of significance on connecting people and changed a lot of things in life. Whether one said they were good or not is not where I'm going with this, Ruth. That they just changed certain things in social life. And that's more about kind of what I was saying, like with Claude Fisher's book about the telephone. I mean, that's what I meant, rather than there's good things and bad things, or who owns them. I really was just focused in on what are the social consequences of this, whether it was good or bad.
Okay. I'm going to talk loudly. So the only other point I wanted to make, and again, I'm not an expert on sort of, sort of income distribution in different countries, right? But I think it was interesting recently. Somebody pointed out to me that, the same technological sort of changes that have happened in the U.S. versus China have correlated with different periods in both of those countries of economic sort of decline for certain groups versus growth, right? So during the same time in China, again, lots of problems with China, but they took a lot of people out of poverty during the same time that those technological advances were happening. So again, I think that leads to different feelings about technology in certain areas, right? And there's also, back to the idea that there are other forces at play in terms of sort of labor power, right? That then couples with technology, and I wonder just how much we can really attribute to technology as opposed to some of these fundamental political underminings of labor, which again, I've heard it said in other presentations, and I think it was in materials even for today, that has actually been a bigger driver of some of these challenges than the technology itself. It's the technology was an enabler of sort of political forces. Anyways, I think there's other people in the audience who maybe want to ask different questions. So,
Can I just say something about Martine's point too? I don't want to get too narrow in our consideration of technology because maybe that precision helps us say yes and no. But technology, at least from the point of view of the skill bias technological change literature, the assembly line was a technology change. It's actually the template technology for the entire paradigm. And it's an intersection of human relations with the products. And it's the way in which the product is assembled and produced and how they substitute holistic for part by part assembly and construction. It seems to be beyond our purview, and yet in a lot of the calculations and so on that many of us sociologists and economists are doing, it's incorporated, and I think it's a loss to us if we separate the two. I think that the human relations part of the technology, the way in which the workers are related to their productive work, mediated through a device or mediated just through where they stand in a room, is an important thing to keep our eye on, because it does illuminate the nature of the problems we're trying to deal with. And I think that the problems that labor unions dealt with in the 20s are echoed. We hear echoes of them today precisely because the key point is in that human technology interface, and not at the point of what is the device.
I see your point. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. I have a number of questions for the panel. The first part deals with if you could define skills-based technology change. And then when you talked about your study, you reference on the one end of your chart there, the spectrum, what I'm going to consider the level of education and the different jobs associated, teachers, professors, whatnot. And as I understand it correctly, is within that broad group of those individuals that are in the field of education, that incrementally within the occupation, it seems to me that if they get, as I understand it, if they get greater education or some reinforcement of their education, they have a greater rate of return. As a practical matter, what's the importance of that when those jobs, in many respects, are not the most high-paying jobs overall? And then with respect to the gig economy, if they didn't have a gig job, it seems to me they wouldn't have a job unless there's a social framework in which to do that. So it seems to me that maybe the gig is better than nothing despite all its flaws and the necessary need to correct those flaws. And the second part of that deals with currently we're faced with a labor shortage. Where do you see then the gig economy role in the labor shortage as we know it? Are people moving out of that gig economy, or is the gig economy where the labor shortage occurs, and what do you see as the long-term trends? And lastly, I guess to Frida, I'm interested in how that actually works, your company. As I understand it, I'm an employer, I want to hire people, I get a bunch of resumes shifted to me, I got to sort those things out. They have their inherent biases in terms of how those are scanned, what have you. How would you sell that to me as an employer if I'm trying to get a broader or diverse workforce, and what does that add, and how does that correct the problems that I have with just looking at a resume, and how does that translate in getting that gig person the job, the interview that he or she wants to have?
Okay, go ahead.
So I should start off by saying we don't do a ton of gig stuff specifically. I mean, we do work with blue collar employers, but they aren't necessarily the Ubers and whatnot of the world. I mean, no particular reason other than they're companies that are specifically focused on gig work. So do you want me to continue to answer the question, or are you primarily focused on gig work?
No.
Oh.
No, I'm not. I just really sort of want to
Okay,
understand
sure.
what your company
Yeah,
actually
sure.
does as if I'm an
Yep.
employer of any kind.
Yeah,
You know,
okay, sure. So basically, you're a big Fortune 500 company. You are trying to, either level the playing field or hire more equitably, and you're struggling to do so with your current practices. There's sort of three kinds of biases that most employers struggle with. So first is the fact that every big employer I've ever spoken to says, I get, 200,000 applicants, but I don't have enough recruiters to review resumes, so I actually only look at 20,000. Well, how do they select those 20,000? They select them, they narrow the pool by looking at people that come from the same schools as I do, people that come from employee referrals, blah, blah, blah. So already the diversity of that 10 or 20 or 30% they're looking at is much less than the broader application. So by implementing an automated tool, you can look at everyone and put everyone on the same playing field, right? So that's point number one. Point number two, there are lots of old assessment tools. So the pre-hire assessment market is full of very biased tools, most in the form of cognitive testing, so very typical paper and pencil cognitive tests that they put even sort of like Walmart greeters through. Those have tremendous racial bias in particular. So for every 10 Caucasians that pass the standard cognitive test, only 3 African Americans and 4 Latinos do. So that's another form of bias that we remove. And then the third one is the resume bias that I was mentioning before in terms of the audit studies they've done on resumes. What we do is we ensure that all of our algorithms basically have a 1-to-1 passing ratio for gender, ethnicity, and neurodiversity status and age. Does that make sense? So basically, if I'm a Caucasian applying and I'm a Hispanic or an African American, I basically have the same likelihood of passing the pymetrics algorithm. The way that we accomplish this, and still obviously have some predictive value, right? It's not just a random number generator. The way that we accomplish this is and again, you guys all have cognitive science departments or work with universities that do. Cognitive science has developed basically a nonverbal way of studying the brain Meaning that if you want to look at memory, we don't ask you, like most cognitive science experiments are done in an MRI scanner, where the only thing you can really do is play computer games, and those are all nonverbal in nature. We've known for a long time that nonverbal assays are far less biased because they don't involve language, they don't involve educational status, and so on and so forth. So, for example, even with math, even with numerosity, which is what you're trying to assess using a math problem like on the SAT, we actually have a version that is completely nonverbal. And that's how we collect data on the same types of attributes that you might be interested in cognitive, social, and emotional aptitudes like attention or memory or planning or altruism or emotional sensitivity in a way that puts everybody on the same playing field, if that makes sense. So very tactically, somebody goes through 20 to 25 minutes of behavioral tests, basically, things you do on the computer. You can do them on your smartphone or a computer, and they are an additional data input that an employer would use, usually in combination with a resume. We haven't totally been able to get people off that resume, but sometimes without a resume, and it's an equalizing yet still predictive signal. It's trying to find people that look like your current workforce from an inherent aptitude perspective, but don't look like your current workforce from a demographic perspective.
The next question.
Is this on?
Hey, use the
Okay.
switch.
So that's a very detailed question. So you're right. In some cases, we have workers who are doing gig work because the alternative is no work. But one of the big challenges that happens with gig work is that it's actually very time consuming. So even on these elite platforms, workers regularly are checking the platform every day, several times a day. They're putting together these proposals. These gig platforms sort of dangle this promise of you can get this job, you can get $10,000, you can get $25,000, we'll get you that short-term engagement. A better strategy would probably be if we actually changed our unemployment system. So we know that individuals who are age 40 and above, if they lose their jobs, are going to have a very long job search. It's one of the things that's more likely to be correlated with being long-term unemployed is being older than age 40 or 50. And so what we should probably do is change our unemployment system to actually provide additional benefits, additional weeks of coverage for individuals who are 40 and above. Another issue that comes up with this gig work is that we see that the way our unemployment system is set up right now is that if you have a part-time job or if you had 2 jobs previously and you have to go on unemployment, you might be disqualified from receiving unemployment based on the amount of money you were making. So if you are making more than $500 a week, you won't get any unemployment assistance. So this makes this gig work appealing to people because maybe they lost one source of income, but now they're disqualified for unemployment, and so they're able to do some of the gig work. So we should probably change our employment system to make it easier for people who are engaged in what I call polyemployment, multiple jobs, multiple sources of income, to still qualify for benefits. One of the issues that came up actually in my work on the impact of the pandemic on gig workers is that there was sadly another person with a doctorate who was a physical therapist in a local hospital, and her hours were slashed. Well, she had been getting overtime, she had been working 50 hours a week, she had student loans, and so when her hours get slashed, she's still making too much to qualify for unemployment, so she ends up doing Instacart 3 to 4 days a week, and actually having to go to the bathroom in her car because there are no public bathrooms. And so we see these sort of survival strategies. And what happens is that when workers are turning to this gig work thinking they're having a solution, it can actually make it harder for them to be looking for other things. Gig work is exhausting. You don't want to be looking for another job afterwards. It's taking up a lot of your time to be sitting in the parking lot or constantly applying for jobs. So I would like to see us actually have some policy solutions that take away this gig work survival strategy or side hustle.
Sorry about that. The other question I had is with respect to the current labor shortage. Where do you see the gig work, headed in that respect?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I've interviewed a number of workers who wanted to work throughout the pandemic. They were actually applying for remote jobs. They were applying for anything they could find. And they actually reported back that some of the employers were definitely offering below minimum wage. I think that part of the issue is that employers are not responding to what it is that workers want. We know that workers would like to be able to work remotely, at least partially. We know that workers want flexibility, and a lot of the other jobs that are out there are not offering flexibility. All of us in this room have plenty of flexibility. We are in a conference on a Friday afternoon, and for some of us, this is part of our job. But for lots of other people, the idea of being able to go to the doctor or pick up your kid early from school is not necessarily available to them. And so gig work offers that promise. And I think we could get rid of the labor shortage in a heartbeat if we increased the wages and offered more flexible scheduling.
Just a follow-up, then it seems to me that that would result in the gig worker having some political strength. Why isn't that translated? I mean, if there is a job shortage, and the reason there is a job shortage is because we have a response that the people still want some of the positive aspects of what's involved in gig work, why doesn't that translate into the gig worker ending up with more positive benefits than negative benefits?
Gig workers are incredibly isolated. They can't organize because they're 1099 workers. And although sometimes there are efforts to try and organize or bring public attention to their plight, they don't have the same power as a sort of organized class, as an organized group. I think that we have started to see some changes. Instacart delivery workers were able to draw, and Ruth knows lots about this, they were able to draw attention to the fact that the company was keeping their tips. I would use the term stealing, but legally as 1099 workers, they don't get their tips. And when they were able to bring attention to that, the company changed their policies. So I think if we start to see more attention paid to the plight of gig workers, that increases their power. But also we don't actually have gig workers in every industry. People often don't know. Just like academics don't necessarily know that the person next to them is an adjunct, people in offices, delivery workers, don't necessarily know the person working next to them might be a 1099 worker. And so we would need to see more attention paid to people's status. I'm not entirely certain how to do that, but that would probably be part of what would need to happen.
Can I jump into this conversation too? One of the points that I was trying to emphasize is that employment institutions matter. Why did Uber think they could monopolize taxi driving? There was this thing called a medallion. It wasn't just that there was a supply and demand. Anybody who wanted a ride could put up their hand, and somebody in the community would drive by in a yellow car and pick them up. You needed permission to be that person in a yellow car. And that was perceived by some as a market inefficiency. They couldn't meet. There was more demand for rides on a rainy afternoon right after, getting out of work than there was at any other time. But the supply was fixed and nobody would respond. And so this was actually a positive thing. This was the thing that made Uber seem, wow, I'm actually going to get a ride home when it's raining. I can walk home on a sunny day, but no, I can also easily get a yellow car because everybody's preferences are the same. This is what I mean by institutions. Every specific occupation has that kind of wrinkle. In the case of taxi driver, it's the medallion. In the case of why is it that every increment to education results in higher pay for admittedly less than optimally paid public school teachers in America. Mississippi public school teachers make $50,000 a year. I mean, it's a staggeringly low, I think, relative to their credentials and skills, but that's also an institution, and so what I'm saying is that there are, in every specific occupation, some rules that determine it. rules way beyond what we can infer from supply and demand. And that, the study of that is what gives the texture to the sociological understanding of the workplace, and why many of us are in this particular niche of sociology, is that that's what motivates us, is to understand those and articulate those. And so I think we all have an implicit supply-demand model in the back of our head. You ask a question about why, when the job market is tight, don't gig workers get a bump up in their pay, or why aren't there incentives enough out there to get them to work? It's that there are these other barriers, these other institutions, these other things that are, on the one hand, protection for those who do take the job. The other, they do reflect the relative power that some people have versus others. And so that's our job, is to articulate those, and that's why we've been talking about them.
The definition of the skills-based technology, John. And the other thing is, regarding your study, what's the practical implication of that? I mean, what am I supposed to?
Have to leave time for some other questions.
I just want to, I'll give him one quick hit on that. It is skill-biased technological change. The model has two types, not my model, the Golden and Katz model, has two kinds of workers, skilled and unskilled. And the thing that's driving inequality is that the technological changes of the 80s and 90s wiped out a lot of jobs that unskilled people went into, and while there was growth in the jobs available to skilled workers. That's literally it. That's the bias. The B is not based, it's biased, and it is biased in favor of skilled workers, and it refers to that period 1980 to 2000 roughly.
Dr. Mohan.
Hi. So I was hoping that the panel would have some comments on advancement of technology and equity at a global scale, right? So US tends to be at the forefront of technology advancements in almost all fields. And I wonder if there are studies on what does this mean for, countries that are coming right behind versus countries who may be far behind in the developing scale. And I know you started to get into a little bit of it with your work with United Nations and the impact, technological advancements that US and Russia have on countries that, are not as advanced. So I was wondering if there were ways to think about it.
Want to try to take a stab at that?
Big question. I can just throw out some observations. So I did a lot of work on the history of robotics. And it was interesting that the countries that developed robotics and automation were primarily in Europe, North America, and Japan. And China, even though they had the industrial capacity, and India had the industrial capacity, because they also had vast labor markets to do a lot of the work that automation would normally replace, they never invested in that until very recently. Which comes to, I think, some of the things about skills, which is automation doesn't just sort of happen, right? We look at jobs and the classic model of Taylorism, you routinize the job and you make it very repetitive first with humans, and then you can automate that job. And so you also try to make it, break it down into components, break it down into different ways, like the assembly line. So you have interchangeable parts, you have interchangeable workers. That's sort of the ideal, but it doesn't always work that way. The other interesting thing in terms of information and communication technologies is the certain leapfrog effect that you get. So it took a century to get telephone systems across North America, but many parts of what we might call the developing world jumped right over that to cell phones and smartphones. There's still, of course, a lot of work being done to get broadband internet to many parts of the world, and indeed a race, I would say, amongst many of the big tech companies, and even Silicon Valley versus China in terms of who's going to supply the internet to Africa or other parts of Asia, because that's huge markets and billions of people and lots of revenue and a lot of data to extract from all of those people. So on the one hand, they're sort of jumping over a lot of technology. On the other hand, A lot of those technologies may not be developed indigenously, and so they're also going to be exploitative. So that, Silicon Valley is going to extract data, China's going to extract data, and that's not going to come for free.
Go. Okay.
Yeah. So one thing we're seeing with these elite, so of course technologies like Uber can be transported to other places, but we're also seeing this with the elite gig workers. So that PhDs in India, in Poland, in Ukraine are actually posting on some of these platforms like Collabtree, where you can hire a PhD in the US for $40 to $50 an hour, or in another country for $5 to $15 an hour. And so some of the elite gig workers in the US that I talk to complain that this means that they're now having to compete against people in countries where the standard of living is lower, or where the expectations of wages are lower. And it makes it harder for them, even as they then try to sort of capitalize on their American credentials. But it does open up some of these opportunities to people who might not otherwise be able to get in touch with some of these executives and companies.
That's interesting.
In our own work, publishing, dealing with copy editing used to be a conversation. It can't be a conversation anymore because the other person is 12 hours away. They're in the exact flipped time zone, and so it's only email communication. You can never talk through. But this is what I was trying to say with the paragraph, and get expert feedback on that. All you get is the marked up manuscript, track changes, because it's all that kind of work was too expensive in the United States, and now it's all done in English-speaking other parts of the world, Singapore and India.
Okay, so all right, I guess we're done with those questions. So I wanted to ask a general question to the panel myself. It seems like a lot of the papers from this session and also yesterday's session suggested that certain technological innovations facilitated transferring power from workers to both employers and consumers in different ways, right? So there's obviously the ride-hailing examples for consumers. Amazon, consumers can stay in their pajamas, all day long and buy boxes and things like that. And it's interesting to me, one of the things I've noticed over the last few years and has accelerated during the pandemic is that people don't say, oh, I love being a consumer now. That doesn't seem to be a dominant discourse, but it seems like, well, on some level, the consumer is benefiting, often to the detriment of the worker, right? And then, of course, we have this issue about the employer and what the employer can do to control the worker, to extract more value from the worker, and all these things. And I thought Peter's point was very important, and it was kind of hinted at yesterday, that there are ways of organizing work using these technologies that wouldn't necessarily favor the employer and disempower the worker to the same extent. And there was, I believe, there was a ride-hailing service in New York that was worker-owned for a while, and I tried to look for it, but I couldn't find it on my phone anymore. So I guess my sort of the big question here is, are there ways of using technology that would equalize the playing field between the worker, the consumer, and I guess in some sense the business owner or investor or whoever is actually benefiting from these models? So I don't know if anyone would want to address that kind of question here.
Well, I might add another dimension to it, and especially with respect to surveillance capitalism. And so the sense in which a lot of the applications like Google or Amazon or in some sense free has been a way for these companies to avoid antitrust legislation. And there's a great paper on this. Specifically, the entire business model for Amazon was designed to sort of avoid antitrust. And the recent interpretations of antitrust are based on pricing. And so if you have a monopoly, you should be price gouging. And so if you're offering things at lower costs, which Amazon does, then that's not the case. If you're Facebook and it's free, how can we be exploiting monopoly? We're free, right? And so all these historic concepts of antitrust become inapplicable. But in many ways, they were designed, like these companies are designed that way to avoid those kinds of regulations. A ton of Uber software was designed to avoid regulation. And that's a sort of a cost savings thing. But in terms then of like, how do we as a civil society or a government, so there's a lot of discussion in Congress, like antitrust against some of these big companies, but is that really gonna work? Not unless we revise our notion of antitrust, so that it's not just the price of things that matters, because that's gone down dramatically. And yeah, we can sit at home, there's super convenience, but we're paying for it in all these other ways that we don't think about. And there's the social consequences, there's the environmental consequences. And there's all these ways in which, all of these things are being externalized by companies like Amazon, who are, exploiting all the roadways, for instance, right? And have all these drivers out there who are not part of the company, who are not insured, who are causing accidents and causing harm and wear and tear on infrastructure. And they're exploiting all of that without paying for it.
But can I just make a comment? I mean, again, I think it's more around the business model than the technology, right? Because Walmart, all of those criticisms are totally applicable to Walmart, right? They've undercut, I mean, that's how they gain monopolies. They undercut the mom and pop shop. I mean, your point about gig workers, I mean, they don't pay people enough, so they're on Medicaid. I mean, so again, I think it's, and even, Shoshana makes the point that it's the business model that's at fault. It's, you know what I mean? And we've had increasingly conservative, legislature ruling in all these cases, right? The company has rights, you know what I mean? So again, I think it's more around some of the, not to get too political, but some of the political changes and legal ramifications of those changes, right? Like the whole gig stuff started when, whatever it was, like 40, 50 years ago, you could be a secretary and work your way up to the CEO, right? And you actually had examples of doing that. But then with outsourcing, right, like everyone taking staffing and saying, hey, cleaning services is going to be outsourced and admin is going to be outsourced. And that's sort of like that was the initial gig work, right? So again, I think and technology has just put that on steroids, right? So again, I think your point that technology is never neutral and that it's just supporting these pre-existing, social or political, whatever, structures is really the key. I don't say I have a solution to it. I just want to point out the fact that this predates platforms, tech platforms, right? So.
Right, but in those, but previously, even those, oh, it's not on, is it? Better? Oh, much better. I love microphones. But previously those jobs were at least W-2 jobs. And now that they're independent contractors, there are no protections for those workers. And even being a W-2 worker doesn't protect you entirely from sexual harassment, but at least it gives you access to a human resources office and clearer boundaries than working in somebody's living room. But we have seen that in some cases this technology can be used to help workers. So in Juliet Shore's book, After the Gig, she actually talks about some of these cooperatives. Like there's one for stock photos where the money goes back to the workers. And there are still superstars that are making much more money, but at least the money isn't going from them directly to Silicon Valley. And so we should probably see more efforts to sort of develop these cooperative efforts where the platforms are owned by the workers. And
that's
that
an
would
interesting idea. But I want to underscore and redirect back toward make them W-2s. Get rid of this loophole that has been exploited through the 1099s. And it's not just the tech companies. That son that I mentioned, who was the personal digital assistant, eventually got a job, the best job there is in his industry. He's a photographer. He was a photographer at Vogue for 10 years until the pandemic hit. 1099 by Condé Nast magazines for the 14 years he worked there, the 10 years he worked for 14 years, he didn't work for anybody else, worked more than 40 hours a week, initially for the whole array of magazines and eventually just for Vogue, and never got a single Social Security credit that he didn't pay for directly. And that's if you don't understand the 1099 world, and I didn't until he had this job, that's the key thing. The employer doesn't have to pay the employer's share of Social Security on this. They don't provide any benefits, and they don't withhold any money. and so you have to be your own accountant, your own business office, and your own HR office if you're an independent contractor. And so putting them on an equal footing would be a huge, I think, change in employment relations, helping some workers and maybe not all.
Yeah, and I think
just wanted to say for a moment, we were supposed to end at 11:45, but we're going to go to 12 because we have a number of other questions. I see a question right here from John Zeisman, and then I think Mac told me there's a question from the Zoom, from our Zoom audience. So we'll go to about 12, and then we have a lunch break till 1 o'clock. Okay, so John?
A very brief comment that will become a question. The brief comment is that the regulation of platforms is essentially going to be regulation of the digital economy overall. It's going to be central. And so the question really becomes that we're watching, in Europe in particular, a fundamental shift in the terms on which that is being debated. Essentially with antitrust law shifting from ex post to ex ante, i.e. here are the terms on which you can operate. And so my question, both for Frida, if I may, and for you, Peter, is whether one thinks that the DMA, the Digital Market Act, and DSA, the Digital Services Act, in Europe will, in fact, advance the purposes that we're all discussing, and whether because they will pass, they will become law in Europe, whether that becomes a foundation for trying to advance the debate effectively in the United States, because it'll create trade conflicts which will have to be resolved in law.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're good starts. So we saw it already a few years ago with the GDPR, which, even though it doesn't apply in the U.S., all these U.S. companies that are operating in Europe have to conform to it. I think there's also shortcomings of things like that, which now every page you go to has that little thing that says, yeah, we're giving you cookies, or you can leave the page, which is, I think, is sort of a snide way of saying, yeah, we're conforming to the law, but we're also making it really inconvenient and letting you know that we don't like this law. And you wind up having to click everything and accept all the surveillance anyway, right? Because otherwise you can't get to the web page. So how effective it's going to be, I think, remains to be seen. But Europe, I think, already also has a much bigger advantage when we're talking particularly about any of these employment or gig work issues, because they have healthcare and they have family leave and they have childcare and all these things that don't exist. And so workers are supposed to fight for this on their own, or unions in each particular workplace, where if that was already guaranteed to everybody, I think people would be much more comfortable taking gig work. And I think, what we've seen, and to some of your questions about, there's been huge transformations in how people think about work over the course of COVID. But even before COVID, you could look at airline pilots who are highly skilled, highly trained, who get paid very, very little. And why is that? Because they really want to fly. And in fact, we can mostly or completely automate their jobs. We can completely automate their jobs already, for the most part. But but from a public perception perspective, we like to know that there's a pilot up in the front, right? And there are situations where the technology fails, but there's plenty of autonomous aircraft. But people want to be pilots. Like, there's a desire, it's an identity, it's a vocation. And I think, I think the next panels maybe has some stuff on universal basic income, right? There's this sort of fear that if we give everybody money, then everybody's going to be lazy and consumers of nothing, right? But no, people want to go do stuff and do interesting work that they find important. And pilots are one of those jobs. And so they're willing to work for very, very little pay, because it's very expensive to get your own airplane, right? They can't just sort of do it on your own. So I think, back to your question, I mean, yeah, we have to restructure the whole kind of digital economy in some sense, and what's the new kind of social contract that's embedded in these relationships with these incredibly powerful technology companies that are building really the new infrastructures of our society and our economy, and what are their obligations and responsibilities, and how can we use the power of the state to enforce that?
I think we've got a Zoom question. Yeah.
Hello, this is a question from an anonymous attendee joining us on Zoom. I was wondering if universal basic income is a good solution for gig workers. how to level the ground for blue versus white collar jobs to make it more equitable.
So, the CARES Act was this fantastic step forward in terms of actually giving gig workers access to unemployment assistance at about 50% of what their W-2 colleagues were making. And then, of course, we had that additional $600 a week, which disappeared, and then we have the extra $300 a week. So this, in many ways, functions as it continues onward, sort of like universal basic income. And working with the grad students that I have on my team at UNC, we've found that in interviewing these precarious workers, a number of them were actually using, precarious and gig-based workers, were using this unemployment assistance as a form of UBI. And they were using it to actually start planning for their futures and in some cases create businesses. So in terms of whether this UBI could work, I think it could in terms of helping workers to sort of plan more for the future. One woman that we interviewed had twins, infant twins, and she was using her unemployment money to start a microgreens business. She had previously been doing TaskRabbit. She had been doing TaskRabbit while she was 32 weeks pregnant with twins, which actually caused her to go into early labor and have premature babies. And so now she was able to use this unemployment money to start a business that she was doing with the babies. I think UBI, in order to sort of equalize between blue-collar and white-collar workers, would need to be at a certain level that would probably need to be set geographically in order to take into account that the cost of living in New York is very different from in Alabama or Mississippi. I think we would also need to help people to think about how to use that UBI. So this woman, fortunately, had a partner who was sort of familiar with business startups and ways to do it. Some of the other workers we talked to wanted to start businesses, but sort of got stuck with, they couldn't figure out how to get started. They couldn't figure out the budgeting. And so I would like to see UBI be implemented with programs to help people think about what they're going to do with the money and get started with businesses. And I think that that could have pretty positive implications for our society. We've seen during the CARES Act time that people were using this money to do good things.
Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, we're over there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I wonder what you think about content creators on YouTube, like influencers. Like, are they a new class of worker? Would they be classified as gig workers? Because I've been reading reports, a lot of people are quitting, what's considered regular work to actually create content on a variety of platforms. So what rights should they have?
Oh, that's a really good question. I actually wanted to do a research project on influencers, but it didn't get funded yet. So if anyone wants some, toss some money this way. Influencers are really fascinating because in many ways they can both be a tool for entrepreneurs to sort of bring attention to new products, especially if an entrepreneur doesn't have a lot of money and they get these sort of micro influencers. At the same time, some of these influencers go on to become their own brands, to become their own companies, in this really fascinating divide. I think that influencers, in some ways, they probably should be 1099 workers because they can control what they're doing, but there are platform issues there. So if they are on YouTube, for instance, or if they're on TikTok, those platforms can still control what they put on the platforms. If they are on Twitch, there are things that they're not allowed to show, they're not allowed to do. And we've seen some content creators, such as the ones on OnlyFans, have really been affected by platform policies in a way that would suggest that maybe they are or should be categorized as W-2 employees. The platforms are sort of dictating what they can show, what they can't. They're affecting when workers are getting paid, that type of thing. So I would like to see additional protections being put in, even for those influencers and content creators, especially if they are on one platform or they're becoming very dependent on one platform. I think that's sort of the key to whether somebody should be considered W-2 is if they are dependent on one or two employers, and the employers really have the power and the control.
I would just say from a media perspective, because a lot of my students are filmmakers and podcasters, and so there's that democratization of access. So anybody can put up a film on YouTube, anybody can post a podcast, and at first that's enormously, empowering to a lot of people. But what you see is what Bjornson, McAfee talk about is these elites. Like it's much easier if you're already a celebrity to then just put out a podcast and get millions of followers than it is to build up from the ground up. And then you look at those individuals, say on YouTube, who are able to actually make a living at it, and they're working insane number of hours, constantly in production, and they have no benefits. They have no guaranteed future income. It's only what revenue they can generate, which also has other perverse effects. So I also study misinformation and disinformation. So you can find a lot of things on YouTube that are merely designed to exploit the algorithms, often against children, because children don't know what to click on. And so you have just absurdist or even harmful content for children that gets tied into all the search terms around Peppa Pig and other things, so that kids don't click on it. It just keeps playing forever, and they're generating tons of revenue off of showing garbage to children, or worse, conspiracy theories and things that sensationalize misinformation, because that's going to get clicks and that's going to generate revenue. So there's all those sorts of perverse effects that we also would want to try to avoid. But ultimately, you don't get that job security, even though you can get $1 million a year in advertising off of YouTube. But it's a handful of people who are able to achieve that, and there's millions, if not billions, of people uploading content trying to achieve that. So in some ways, yeah, it's great. And I think the real benefit is the DIY type stuff that shows up there. If we're talking about, retraining yourself during the CARES Act, or how do you do lifelong learning, and there's so much great information about, how to fix your car, how to grow microgreens, how to start a business. But what we also know from the literature on, online education is that you need a sort of universal basic level of education and internet access and hardware in order to take advantage of that. And students from traditionally, underserved communities don't have the educational skills to be successful in online learning the way that people who have higher levels of education and are much more experienced with it are able to exploit those forms of education. So we really need to think about not just the fact that there's online courses, but how do we get everybody to the level where they can take advantage of those online courses.
We have one more Zoom question, or no? Okay. Okay. Oh, it's noon. Okay.